I retired and bought a quiet farmhouse in Tennessee to finally rest and enjoy my remaining years in peace. Then my daughter-in-law called with an order. "My brother is moving in. If you do not like it, we will just sell the place immediately." I did not argue. But when they showed up to claim their territory, they found exactly what I had prepared for them. My name is Jonas. I am 69 years old, a black man who spent 40 years as a chief engineer designing and maintaining underground power grids. I am accustomed to working in total darkness and with absolute precision. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly stand your ground against intensely entitled people who thought they could walk all over you. The heavy iron wrench slipped from my grip and clattered violently against the wooden floorboards. I was lying on my back under the kitchen sink of my farmhouse, tightening a stubborn copper pipe that had been leaking since Tuesday. The physical labor grounded me. Since my wife Evelyn passed away 3 years ago, the quiet isolation of this property was the only thing keeping my mind steady. The sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone on the counter broke the morning silence. I slid out from under the sink, wiping thick black grease onto my denim overalls, and answered. It was Megan, my white daughter-in-law. She offered absolutely no greeting. She did not ask how my day was going or how my old joints were handling the damp southern weather. Her voice was sharp, entitled, and entirely devoid of warmth. She sharply announced that her brother Bradley was driving down from the city and would be moving into my main guest room tomorrow morning. She stated flatly that Bradley needed a quiet place to find himself after another failed business venture. I stood there holding the phone, staring out the kitchen window at the expansive green acres I had meticulously maintained. I calmly told her the guest room was currently being used to store Evelyn's old weaving equipment. Megan scoffed loudly through the speaker. She said I needed to clear the room out immediately because Bradley required the space. Before I could properly respond to her brazen demand, the line fumbled with a harsh crackle. Devin snatched the phone from his wife. My son used to be a humble boy, but years working as a financial broker in the city had infected him with an arrogant, relentless edge. Devin spoke to me not as a father, but as a subordinate employee who was failing to meet a quarterly quota. He did not ask for my permission to move his brother-in-law into my home. He gave me a direct, unquestionable order. Devin firmly reminded me that the initial down payment for this farmhouse came directly through his corporate business account. He wielded that financial fact like a blunt weapon, attempting to bludgeon me into immediate submission. He demanded that I clear out the main house for Bradley without any delay. He insisted that Bradley needed the primary living space to spread out, regroup, and recover from his self-inflicted financial ruin. When I calmly mentioned that this was my retirement home and I needed my space, Devin raised his voice. He threatened me with absolute chilling coldness. He stated that if I resisted this arrangement or made things difficult for Bradley in any way, he would simply force a sale of the property. He reminded me that the real estate market was highly favorable right now, and he could easily liquidate the asset to recover his corporate investment. Listening to my own flesh and blood threaten to render me homeless was a profound and staggering betrayal. Devin was entirely blinded by his desperate desire to appease Megan and her toxic family. He considered me a mere tenant in a property he truly believed he owned outright. He viewed my lifelong sacrifices as irrelevant historical details. I had worked brutal double shifts in the damp, freezing tunnels of the city grid just to pay for his elite college education. I had literally bled to ensure he never had to experience the crushing poverty I grew up in. Now he was treating me like an expired liability on a balance sheet. He spoke with the unyielding confidence of a man who believed he held all the power and all the leverage. He laid out the timeline like a dictator, stating Bradley would arrive by noon tomorrow and expected the main house to be entirely vacant and freshly cleaned. Devin warned me not to embarrass him or his wife with any stubborn behavior. He reiterated the threat of selling the land right out from under my feet if I caused any friction. The conversation was not a family negotiation. It was a hostile eviction notice disguised as a temporary family favor. Devin fully expected me to cower, apologize, and obediently carry out his commands, just as I had quietly accommodated his extravagant lifestyle choices in the past. He believed my profound silence over the years was a symptom of weakness and old age. He assumed I had lost my sharp edge. He assumed wrong. I listened to the dial tone humming in my ear. I wiped the remaining grease from my calloused hands using an old cotton rag. I did not raise my voice during the call. I did not argue or attempt to reason with a man who had already discarded his basic respect for me. I simply ended the call and placed the phone face down on the granite counter. My breathing remained perfectly level. Instead of heading to the guest room to clear out Evelyn's precious weaving belongings, I walked directly down the hall into my private study. I approached the heavy iron safe tucked discreetly behind my solid oak desk. I spun the combination dial with the steady, practiced rhythm of an engineer manipulating a delicate circuit. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. I reached deep into the back compartment and pulled out a thick manila envelope containing the original trust deed we had signed 3 years ago. I slid the heavy parchment onto my desk and smoothed it out under the warm light of the reading lamp. The document clearly detailed the true and legally binding nature of that down payment. Devin genuinely thought he had purchased my complete obedience with his corporate funds. He was entirely unaware of the intricate legal trap I had meticulously built around that specific financial transaction to protect my estate from his relentless ambition. I looked closely at the embossed notary seal gleaming at the bottom of the page. Bradley was arriving tomorrow morning to conquer my home and assert his dominance. Devin was fully prepared to cast me out into the street to please his wife. Let them come. I folded the deed carefully, placed it back into its protective envelope, and locked the steel door of the safe securely. The war they wanted had just been authorized. I turned off the study lamp and walked back to the kitchen to finish tightening the leaking copper pipe, completely unbothered by their hollow threats. The roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the morning quiet of the property. A rented moving van lurched off the gravel driveway, its heavy, mud-caked tires tearing directly through the meticulously curated bed of blue hydrangeas. Evelyn had planted those specific flowers during her final remission phase, coaxing them from the Tennessee soil with a stubborn, quiet grace. Now the crushed petals lay ground into the wet dirt. The van doors swung open with a metallic screech. Bradley hopped down from the cab. He wore a stained designer tracksuit and carried the manic, jittery energy of a man running from his own failures. 2 unidentified men followed him out of the back of the truck. They were thick-necked, silent laborers who looked more like hired muscle than professional movers. Without offering a single word of introduction or apology for the ruined garden, the men began dragging massive, unmarked wooden crates out of the van. The boxes lacked any standard shipping labels and looked heavy enough to snap a suspension spring. The laborers hauled the first crate straight up the porch steps, kicking the front door wide open. The iron corners of the wooden boxes scraped violently against the polished hardwood floors of the living room, gouging deep, permanent white scratches into the dark oak finish. Jonas stood on the porch with his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the mindless destruction of his home unfold with the trained, calculating eye of a chief engineer assessing a structural collapse. He silently registered the precise dimensions of the crates, noting the reinforced ventilation slits cut into the sides. Ordinary furniture did not require industrial cooling vents. He calculated the immense physical weight pressing down on his floorboards and cataloged every violation of his space. He said absolutely nothing to them. Bradley strutted into the living room, surveying the space as if he had just conquered a small nation. He pulled a crushed cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a long, arrogant drag. He did not bother looking for an ashtray. He simply flicked his wrist, dropping a cluster of gray ash directly onto the antique oak dining table. That table was the true centerpiece of the home. Evelyn had restored it entirely by hand, spending countless weekends sanding and varnishing the aged wood until it gleamed flawlessly. Jonas stepped into the room, his eyes fixed firmly on the smoldering ash resting on the polished surface. Bradley exhaled a thick cloud of acrid smoke toward the ceiling. He turned to Jonas with a sneer that perfectly mirrored the intense entitlement of his sister Megan. Bradley announced that the main house was now his exclusive territory. He declared that he needed absolute silence and complete privacy to orchestrate his imminent financial comeback. He pointed a dismissive, mocking finger toward the renovated barn situated far behind the main pasture. Bradley ordered Jonas to pack his personal belongings and relocate to the barn, immediately citing Devin's explicit directive as his ultimate authority. The demand hung heavily in the air, a brazen challenge meticulously designed to provoke an explosive reaction. Jonas felt a familiar deep-seated surge of rage tightening his chest. For 40 years he had managed the delicate, lethal flow of high-voltage electricity beneath the crowded city streets. He knew exactly how to ground a dangerous live wire before it sparked a fatal catastrophe. He applied that exact same ruthless discipline to his own temper. He swallowed the anger, locking it away behind an impenetrable mask of absolute stoicism. Arguing with a parasite only validated its continued presence. Jonas walked silently past Bradley. He went into the master bedroom, pulling a weathered canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the deep closet. He packed only the strict essentials. He gathered a few changes of durable clothes, his specialized engineering tools, his daily medication, and the leather-bound journal that belonged to Evelyn. He zipped the heavy bag shut with a swift, definitive motion. Walking back through the living room, Jonas did not cast a single glance at the man actively defiling his home. He stepped off the porch and walked the 100 yards across the damp grass directly to the barn. The air was incredibly thick with humidity and the tragic smell of the crushed hydrangeas. The barn was highly insulated and exceptionally functional, an open space of raw timber and concrete floors where he usually kept his heavy equipment. Jonas set his heavy duffel bag down on a sturdy wooden workbench. He arranged his few personal belongings with deliberate, measured precision. He watched through the dusty window pane as the 2 hired laborers finished unloading the remaining heavy crates and quickly drove away in the rented van, leaving Bradley alone in the main house. The true invasion had been completely bloodless. Devin and Megan firmly believed this forced relocation was the ultimate humiliation, a final subjugation of an old man who had long outlived his usefulness. They vastly mistook his strategic retreat for absolute surrender. Jonas sat on a wooden stool in the dim light of the barn, his posture perfectly straight. He did not feel defeated. He felt intensely focused. He understood the hidden mechanics of power far better than anyone in his toxic family. He knew that when you give a deeply reckless man enough rope and unsupervised territory, he will inevitably construct his very own inevitable and fatal gallows. At exactly midnight, the ambient environment of the property changed abruptly. The perimeter security lights surrounding the farmhouse flickered, violently dimmed to a dull orange glow, and struggled to remain illuminated. Jonas stood silently by the barn window in the total darkness. As a career grid engineer, he instantly recognized the specific signature of a massive, unregulated voltage draw. He watched the main house intently. Through the large living room windows, he could see the harsh, unnatural glare of hundreds of flashing LED indicators. Bradley was tearing the wooden crates apart with a heavy crowbar. He was rapidly unboxing a massive, highly illegal cryptocurrency mining rig. Banks of high-powered computer processors and industrial cooling fans were being stacked aggressively against the living room walls. Bradley walked out to the side of the house carrying a heavy set of insulated cutters and thick, unauthorized black cables. Jonas watched carefully as Bradley bypassed the standard residential meter completely. He recklessly spliced the heavy cables directly into the main county power line, feeding the property an extremely dangerous federal offense designed to steal thousands of dollars of commercial electricity. The sheer mechanical roar of the active cooling fans soon drifted across the open yard, sounding exactly like a jet engine trapped inside a wooden box. Jonas did not shout. He did not rush out to intervene or stop the incredibly dangerous theft. He simply pulled his smartphone from his pocket, activated the high-definition video camera, and zoomed in directly on the sparking power line. He steadily recorded every single second of the dangerous, illegal physical connection, capturing Bradley's face perfectly in the harsh utility light. The irrefutable digital evidence was now securely saved. The trap had been baited and flawlessly triggered, without Jonas ever needing to lift a single defensive finger in response. The yellow postal jeep idled at the end of the long gravel driveway. The carrier reached out the window, dropping a thick stack of certified mail into the rusted iron mailbox before accelerating away, kicking up a cloud of gray dust. Jonas stepped off the porch, the morning sun already burning hot against his shoulders. He walked the 100 yards to the road, his boots crunching loudly in the quiet country air. He pulled the stack of envelopes from the box. Most were standard utility bills and local advertisements, but buried in the middle was a heavy, oversized envelope lined with stark red borders. The return address belonged to a major commercial bank headquartered in New York. Jonas did not receive mail from New York. He carried the stack back to the barn, setting the mundane envelopes aside on his workbench. He took a utility knife and sliced open the red-lined envelope with a single, precise motion. He pulled out a thick packet of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. The header at the top of the first page was printed in bold, unavoidable black letters. It was an official pre-foreclosure notice. Jonas sat heavily on his wooden stool, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the dense legal text. The document clearly stated that the entire Tennessee farmhouse property, including the 50 acres of surrounding land, had been leveraged as collateral against a massive commercial business loan. The principal amount of the loan was $400,000. The loan had been in a state of default for over 90 days, accumulating aggressive late fees and severe penalties. The bank was initiating formal foreclosure proceedings to seize the property and auction it off to recover their losses. Jonas flipped to the final page of the document. At the bottom, next to the notary stamp, was a signature authorizing the collateral pledge. It was his signature. Or more accurately, it was a flawless forgery of his signature. Jonas immediately recognized the sweeping, aggressive curves of the handwriting. It was Devon's work. His son had secretly leveraged his father's home to secure a massive bailout loan. The primary beneficiary listed on the loan documents was Megan's boutique media agency, a company that Jonas knew had been hemorrhaging money for years due to her lavish spending and gross mismanagement. Devon had forged his own father's name on a federal banking document to save his wife's vanity project from imminent collapse. They had deliberately let the loan default. They fully intended to let the New York bank seize the farmhouse and evict Jonas to clear their massive financial liabilities. They planned to sacrifice his retirement, his home, and his peace of mind to erase their own catastrophic mistakes. They had orchestrated a complete financial wipeout, assuming Jonas was too old, too slow, and too technologically inept to ever uncover the origin of the fraud before the county sheriff arrived to physically remove him from the premises. They had bet their entire future on his total vulnerability. The profound cruelty of the plan did not incite a sudden outburst of rage. Instead, it triggered a cold, absolute clarity within Jonas. He understood the exact dimensions of the battlefield now. His son was not merely entitled or arrogant. He was a desperate, calculating predator. Jonas placed the documents flat on the workbench. He did not tear them or throw them. He treated them as highly valuable schematic diagrams, detailing the structural weaknesses of an enemy fortress. He knew that reacting emotionally to a financial attack was a tactical error. He needed to trace the current directly back to the source. Jonas picked up his cell phone and dialed a private number he had memorized decades ago. Attorney Hayes answered on the second ring. Hayes was a brilliant, aggressive lawyer who specialized in complex corporate trusts and asset protection. He had helped Jonas construct the Evelyn Holdings entity 3 years ago. Jonas methodically explained the contents of the pre-foreclosure notice detailing the forged signature, the loan amount, and the listed beneficiary. He instructed Hayes to immediately run a deep forensic trace on the disbursement of the loan funds. He needed to know exactly where the $400,000 had landed. Hayes promised an update within the hour. Jonas remained in the barn, silently sharpening his tools while Bradley's cooling fans continued to roar from the main house. 50 minutes later, Hayes called back. His voice was grim and sharply focused. The forensic trace revealed a shocking deviation from the official loan paperwork. The bank had indeed issued the funds under the pretext of rescuing Megan's media agency. However, the money had not remained in the agency's corporate accounts. Within 48 hours of the initial deposit, the entire $400,000 had been rapidly funneled through a series of shell companies and offshore wire transfers. The final destination of the funds was a secure, encrypted offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The sole owner of that offshore account was Bradley. The entire operation was a coordinated, closed-loop frame-up. Devon and Megan had used Jonas's property to steal nearly $500,000, transferring the stolen wealth directly to her brother to hide it from federal regulators and bankruptcy courts. Bradley was not a recovering addict seeking a quiet retreat. He was the vault holding the stolen fortune. The three of them had weaponized the farmhouse to fund their own illegal enrichment, expecting Jonas to absorb the complete ruin. Jonas listened to the final details of the report. He thanked Hayes for his speed and precision. He did not ask for a defensive strategy. He did not ask how to delay the foreclosure. He instructed Hayes to immediately prepare the legal framework for a completely lethal, irreversible counterstrike. He authorized Hayes to prepare the necessary documents to execute the penalty clauses hidden deep within the Evelyn Holdings Trust Agreement. The time for silent observation was over. The time for demolition had officially begun. The crunch of fresh tires on gravel signaled their arrival. A pristine, jet-black luxury SUV rolled slowly up the driveway, its polished chrome grille reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. The vehicle was entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rugged Tennessee landscape. Jonas remained at his workbench inside the barn, calmly running a sharpening stone over the edge of a heavy steel chisel. Through the open double doors, he watched Devon and Megan step out of the climate-controlled cabin. Megan wore pristine white trousers and oversized designer sunglasses. Devon wore a tailored casual suit entirely inappropriate for a working farm. They approached the barn with deliberate synchronized steps. Megan carried a small, incredibly cheap wicker basket filled with bruised apples and unripened bananas wrapped in tight cellophane. It was an insulting imitation of a thoughtful gift. As they crossed the threshold into the barn, both of them visibly recoiled. Devon pinched the bridge of his nose while Megan overtly covered the lower half of her face with a manicured hand. The interior of the barn smelled strongly of aged hickory wood, metallic motor oil, and the honest sweat of physical labor. It was an environment that deeply offended their delicate city sensibilities. They stood awkwardly near the entrance, shifting their weight, refusing to step any deeper into the workspace than absolutely necessary. Jonas wiped the steel dust from his chisel with a clean rag. He did not offer them a seat or a refreshing drink. He simply waited for the theatrical performance to begin. The sheer audacity of their visit mere days after attempting to steal his property through a forged commercial loan required a masterful deception. Jonas was completely ready to watch them act out their desperate lies. Megan took the lead, stepping forward with a manufactured expression of profound sympathy. She placed the cheap fruit basket on the edge of the workbench, pushing a rusty wrench out of the way. She removed her sunglasses and looked at Jonas with wide, artificially concerned eyes. Her voice dripped with a suffocating, unnatural sweetness. She began to express her deep worries regarding the living conditions of Jonas. She gestured dramatically toward the main house where the relentless, deafening roar of Bradley and his illegal computer servers echoed across the yard. Megan claimed the intense noise and the ambient heat generated by the massive electrical equipment were highly dangerous for a man of his advanced age. She insisted that prolonged exposure to such an environment would inevitably damage his heart and severely deteriorate his mental faculties. Devon stepped up beside her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. He nodded gravely, perfectly playing the role of the dutiful, highly concerned son. He told Jonas that they simply could not bear the thought of him suffering in a damp, uninsulated barn. Devon announced that they had taken the initiative to book a comprehensive health evaluation with a top-tier medical specialist in the city. The appointment was scheduled for the following morning. Megan then reached into her designer handbag and produced a crisp, single-page document attached to a sleek leather clipboard. She slid the clipboard smoothly across the scarred surface of the workbench. She explained that the city clinic required a standard medical consent form to be signed by the patient prior to the initial consultation. She handed Jonas a heavy silver pen, urging him to sign the paperwork quickly so they could process his registration and secure the appointment slot. She framed the urgency as a matter of immense medical necessity. Jonas looked at his son, searching for even a microscopic trace of guilt or hesitation. There was none. The face of Devon was an impenetrable mask of absolute false compassion. They were utilizing the aggressive noise and chaos created by Bradley as a convenient psychological weapon to justify removing Jonas from the property completely. They desperately needed to establish a documented medical foundation of cognitive decline to protect their massive financial fraud. If Jonas was legally classified as senile, his future accusations regarding the forged commercial bank loan would be instantly dismissed by the authorities as the paranoid delusions of a deteriorating old man. Jonas understood the deadly mechanics of their strategy with absolute crystal clarity. They were attempting to preemptively discredit him before the bank initiated the final foreclosure process. They desperately needed his written signature. He stared down at the clipboard resting on the solid wood. The elaborate performance was nauseating, but Jonas maintained his absolute stoicism. He did not challenge the ridiculous medical assertions of Megan. He did not demand an explanation for the sudden, highly suspicious display of family affection. He played the part of the weary, compliant elder, perfectly letting his shoulders slump slightly to feign physical exhaustion. He reached out and accepted the silver pen from the outstretched hand of Megan. Jonas lowered his gaze and read the dense legal text printed on the crisp white paper. It was absolutely not a routine medical consent form. Hidden beneath a deceptive medical header was a highly aggressive, durable power of attorney. The binding clauses were meticulously designed to grant Devon absolute uncontested control over the entire estate of Jonas, all bank accounts, and all physical assets. The very second a physician declared him mentally incapacitated, it was the final fatal trapdoor they needed to secure their stolen wealth. Jonas did not grimace. He did not throw the pen back at them in rage. Instead, he looked up and offered his son and daughter-in-law a warm, incredibly grateful smile. He thanked them sincerely for their touching concern regarding his declining health. Then Jonas deliberately shifted his body weight. He moved the pen from his dominant right hand to his non-dominant left hand. He pressed the silver tip against the bottom signature line. He slowly executed a jagged, uneven, and highly specific signature stroke. It looked exactly like the trembling writing of a rapidly declining old man. Devin and Megan watched him sign with hungry, barely concealed triumph. They snatched the clipboard off the workbench the instant the ink dried completely. They offered rapid, highly dismissive goodbyes, claiming they needed to rush back to the city to finalize the complicated clinic paperwork. They hurried out of the barn, practically sprinting back to their luxury vehicle. Jonas stood motionless by his workbench, watching their vehicles speed down the driveway and disappear onto the main road. He placed his heavy tools back into their designated compartments with care. 10 years ago, following a minor security breach on his primary accounts, Jonas had legally filed a strict right-handed biometric signature mandate with the federal bank and all county registry offices. He had explicitly voided any alternative strokes or left-handed signatures to permanently protect his assets against coercion and devastating fraud. The critical document Devin and Megan were currently speeding away with was not a golden key to a vast fortune. It was a legally invalidated, utterly worthless piece of paper that would soon serve as direct, irrefutable evidence of their attempted extortion. They had confidently walked into the barn expecting to secure his complete destruction. Instead, they had eagerly collected the very rope that would hang them in federal court. Jonas smiled coldly in the empty barn. The counterstrike was quietly armed. The heavy wooden door of the barn groaned as it swung inward. A man stepped over the threshold, bringing with him an overpowering wave of cheap synthetic cologne that completely masked the comforting smell of sawdust and aged hickory. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit and carried a pristine, overstuffed leather medical bag. Megan trailed closely behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her face set in an expression of deep manufactured concern. The man did not bother to formally introduce himself or offer a handshake. He simply unclasped his bag, pulled out a thick legal pad, and began to speak to Jonas with a cloying, condescending tone usually reserved for small, stubborn children. He identified himself only as a specialist hired by the family to conduct a brief routine wellness check. Jonas remained seated on his wooden stool, his hands resting quietly on his knees. He recognized the man instantly. This was not a neurologist or a specialist in geriatric care. This was a disgraced former clinic director named Aris, whose medical license had been severely restricted 2 years ago following a series of highly questionable insurance billing practices. Hayes had forwarded a comprehensive background file on Aris just 3 days prior. Megan had actively sought out a deeply compromised physician, someone entirely willing to falsify official medical records for the right price. Aris did not pull out a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. He completely bypassed any physical examination. Instead, he immediately launched into a rapid-fire sequence of aggressively simplistic memory questions designed solely to establish a documented baseline of severe cognitive decline. He asked Jonas to name the current president, identify the day of the week, and count backward from 100 by sevens. His voice was sharp, impatient, and entirely uninterested in the actual answers. He was not conducting a medical evaluation. He was aggressively leading a witness toward a predetermined, legally binding conclusion of mental incompetence. Jonas understood the deadly mechanics of the ambush perfectly. Aris suddenly stopped his rapid questioning. He dramatically turned his head toward the open barn door. A deafening mechanical roar echoed across the pasture from the main house. The immense industrial cooling fans attached to Bradley's illegal cryptocurrency mining rig were currently running at absolute maximum capacity, fighting against the heavy Tennessee heat. Aris pointed a sharp accusatory finger directly toward the source of the noise. He turned back to Jonas, his eyes narrowing. He adopted a tone of mock sympathy and asked Jonas a highly specific, loaded question. He asked if Jonas had recently purchased those massive, incredibly loud machines. Megan shifted her weight in the doorway. Her eyes locked onto Jonas with an intense, hungry anticipation. She was waiting for him to take the bait. She needed a recorded confession. She desperately needed Jonas to claim ownership of the illegal mining operation. If Jonas admitted to purchasing the machines, Aris would immediately document it as a severe, dangerous symptom of senile dementia. It would provide the perfect legal justification for Devin to execute the forged power of attorney and seize immediate control of the estate. If Jonas vehemently denied purchasing the machines, they would simply spin his denial as a paranoid delusion, further solidifying their false narrative of cognitive decay. It was a perfectly constructed zero-sum trap. Jonas did not shout his innocence. He did not point a finger at Bradley and demand justice. He executed a flawless tactical maneuver. He allowed his hands to develop a slight, highly visible tremor. He slowly lowered his gaze to the dusty concrete floor, adopting the defeated posture of a confused, deeply exhausted old man. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. He nodded his head slowly, repeatedly. With a trembling, quiet voice, Jonas completely and falsely confessed. He stated clearly that he had ordered the heavy machines online a few weeks ago, but he simply could not remember how to shut them off. He claimed the constant noise was giving him terrible headaches, but he was too embarrassed to ask for help. He offered a perfect, pathetic apology for the disruption. Megan practically vibrated with triumph. She bit her lower lip to stop a massive, victorious smile from breaking across her face. Eris aggressively scribbled the false confession onto his legal pad, pressing the pen down hard enough to leave deep indentations on the paper beneath. He snapped the leather portfolio shut with a loud, definitive crack. He offered Jonas a patronizing, entirely empty smile, assuring the old man that his family would take excellent care of him now. Megan stepped forward, her fake concern instantly replaced by brisk, cold efficiency. She smoothly escorted the compromised doctor out of the barn, undoubtedly eager to finalize his illicit payment and secure the forged medical certification. The heavy barn door swung shut, plunging the interior back into cool, dusty shadows. Jonas sat perfectly still for 10 full seconds, listening to the crunch of their tires fading down the gravel driveway. The tremor in his hands vanished instantly, replaced by absolute rigid stability. He slowly unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his heavy flannel shirt. Taped securely to the center of his chest was a high-grade digital audio recorder. A tiny red light blinked steadily, confirming that every single word, every leading question, and his own perfectly delivered false confession had been captured in pristine, uncompressed audio. He peeled the device off his skin, plugged a small transfer cable into the port, and connected it directly to his secured smartphone. Jonas opened a secure encrypted email application. He attached the raw, unedited audio file of the fraudulent medical examination. He typed a brief, legally precise message detailing the identity of the physician, the location of the illicit consultation, and the clear evidence of a conspiracy to commit medical fraud and elder abuse. He did not send the file to Hayes. He did not send it to the local police. He addressed the email directly to the lead investigator of the state medical board, copying the regional director of the Federal Insurance Fraud Division. He pressed send. The digital payload vanished into the network. Megan believed she had just secured the final weapon needed to destroy him. In reality, Jonas had just handed federal authorities the exact coordinates of her execution. Heavy morning humidity clung to the Tennessee pasture as Jonas stood near the edge of the restored barn. He held a pruning shear, meticulously trimming a wild blackberry bush that had crept over the split-rail fence. The crunch of expensive leather shoes on the gravel driveway broke his concentration. Bradley marched aggressively across the front lawn, accompanied by a fast-talking man in a sharp blue suit, carrying a digital measuring wheel and a high-end tablet. The stranger possessed the hungry, restless energy of a commercial real estate appraiser looking for a massive commission. They did not walk to the front door of the main house. They walked directly onto the grass, completely ignoring the established walkways. Bradley pointed expansively across the 50 acres of pristine property, gesturing with wild, sweeping motions. The appraiser nodded rapidly, tapping figures into his screen and rolling his measuring wheel directly past Jonas. Neither man offered a greeting. They did not acknowledge his physical presence. They treated Jonas exactly as if he were a ghost haunting a property he no longer owned. In their minds, the fraudulent medical exam from yesterday had already permanently erased him from the legal equation. Megan had clearly informed her brother that the power of attorney was secured and that the old man would be locked away in a memory care facility within days. Jonas kept his face utterly blank. He snipped another thorny branch from the bush. He watched the 2 men measure the exact dimensions of his lifelong labor. Bradley stopped near the center of the crushed hydrangea bed, his voice carrying easily across the humid air. He possessed the arrogant volume of a man who firmly believed he was untouchable. He loudly declared to the appraiser that the main structure was fully prepared for immediate liquidation. Bradley explicitly stated that the current occupant was a severely compromised old man who was being permanently relocated to a state-run asylum by the end of the week. The appraiser did not flinch at the callous cruelty of the statement. He simply swiped his finger across his glowing tablet, completely unfazed by the tragic family dynamics as long as the underlying asset possessed genuine market value. Bradley demanded a rapid cash offer for the entire parcel. He insisted that his sister and brother-in-law required an expedited closing process to avoid a messy public foreclosure. Jonas set his pruning shears down on the top rail of the wooden fence. He wiped his hands on a clean rag tucked into his overalls. He walked calmly into the barn, retrieved a heavy glass pitcher of freshly brewed iced tea, and filled 2 tall glasses with clinking ice cubes. He carried the tray smoothly across the lawn, approaching the 2 men with the steady, measured gait of an accommodating host. He extended the tray toward them. The appraiser looked mildly surprised by the sudden hospitality, pausing his relentless typing to accept a cold glass. Bradley sneered, snatching the second glass without a single word of gratitude. He took a greedy gulp and immediately turned his back on Jonas to continue his aggressive sales pitch. Jonas did not retreat to the barn. He stood firmly on the grass, folding his hands behind his back. He listened with absolute silence as the 2 men actively discussed the violent destruction of his home. The appraiser pointed his digital pen directly at the barn where Jonas slept. He evaluated the structural integrity of the aged timber and loudly concluded that the outbuilding was a complete liability. He advised Bradley that a commercial developer would need to bulldoze the barn entirely to clear the lot for profitable suburban subdivision. Bradley enthusiastically agreed. He stated that tearing down the old structure would instantly eliminate the foul smell of grease and age that currently ruined the aesthetic of the backyard. They discussed leveling the entire pasture, tearing up the ancient oak trees Evelyn had loved, and pouring miles of fresh concrete over the rich soil. They priced the destruction of Jonas's life with casual, terrifying efficiency. Every sentence was a profound violation. Every casual suggestion of bulldozing his sanctuary was designed to strip away his dignity and provoke a desperate emotional outburst. Bradley wanted him to scream. He wanted the old man to violently attack the appraiser, providing them with the perfect excuse to summon the police and expedite the involuntary psychiatric hold. Jonas denied them that satisfaction. He stood his ground like a weathered stone monument. He monitored his heart rate, keeping it slow and perfectly even. He recognized the immense psychological weakness fueling Bradley's loud performance. True power never needed to boast about its capacity for destruction. True power simply acted when the absolute perfect moment arrived. Jonas swallowed the icy rage building in the back of his throat. He looked at the barn, picturing the heavy iron safe hidden securely inside. He knew exactly what documents rested inside that steel vault. He let them continue pricing the prey, fully aware they were actively negotiating the sale of a slaughterhouse they were already locked inside. The appraiser tapped his screen again, calculating the immense profit margin of a rapid demolition. He suggested that if they handled the zoning permits quickly, the bulldozers could arrive by the following Monday. Bradley smiled triumphantly, savoring the thought of crushing the barn into splintered kindling. Jonas remained entirely serene, offering to refill their empty glasses. The appraiser finished his preliminary physical evaluation and tapped a secure icon on his tablet to access the county digital deed records. A deep furrow formed across his forehead as the official property lines loaded onto his high-resolution screen. He adjusted his stance, suddenly looking very confused. He turned his tablet toward Bradley, pointing a manicured finger at a specific line of bold text near the top of the official registry. The appraiser asked Bradley why the 50 acres of prime agricultural land were explicitly registered under an independent corporate entity called Evelyn Holdings. He noted that Devon's name was completely absent from the primary ground lease. Bradley frowned, his arrogant confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. He squinted at the bright screen, unable to comprehend the complex legal structure staring back at him. He aggressively waved his hand in the air, brushing the revelation off as a meaningless clerical error made by a lazy county clerk. He loudly assured the appraiser that his brother-in-law owned the entire estate outright, and that any minor paperwork issues would be crushed by their aggressive corporate lawyers in the city. Jonas calmly raised his own heavy glass of iced tea to his lips. He took a long, slow sip, letting the cold liquid completely cool his parched throat. He watched the deeply frustrated appraiser reluctantly accept Bradley's highly flimsy explanation and continue typing. Jonas did not offer to correct them. He did not explain the impenetrable legal armor of a generational trust. He simply stood firmly and silently in the bright Tennessee sun, observing the exact moment the enemy blindly stepped onto the hidden snare. He knew Evelyn Holdings was not a minor clerical error. It was the lethal, unyielding trapdoor that would soon swallow them all without any mercy. A torrential rainstorm battered the Tennessee landscape just 2 days after the real estate appraiser departed. Thick sheets of water hammered against the metal roof of the renovated barn. Jonas sat at his workbench cleaning a heavy wrench with a meticulously oiled rag. He watched the main house through the streaked glass window. The farmhouse was not designed to harbor an industrial data center. Inside the living room, the cheap commercial cooling fans Bradley had purchased off an internet surplus auction were beginning to choke. The dense humidity of the southern storm suffocated the ventilation systems. Jonas could hear the distinct high mechanical whine of failing ball bearings cutting through the thunder. The massive cryptocurrency mining rig demanded an uninterrupted massive flow of electricity to process its algorithmic equations. The antiquated residential electrical panel mounted on the side of the farmhouse was groaning under the unprecedented strain. Jonas knew the physical limits of every breaker switch and copper wire inside those walls. He had personally upgraded the system to handle standard household appliances and modest farm equipment. He had absolutely not wired it to sustain the relentless, brutal draw of a rogue server farm. The lights in the main house began to flicker erratically. The yellow glow of the porch bulbs pulsed in rapid, chaotic spasms. The thermal load on the internal wiring was reaching a critical, catastrophic threshold. The main breaker violently tripped with a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the flooded yard. The farmhouse was instantly plunged into absolute darkness. The sudden silence from the dead cooling fans was heavier than the thunderstorm outside. Jonas set his wrench down softly on the wooden bench. He remained perfectly still in the dim light of the barn, anticipating the inevitable panicked reaction. The storm raged on, indifferent to the disaster. The sudden power failure was not isolated entirely to the farmhouse. Jonas looked past the darkened silhouette of the main residence toward the distant county road. The glowing yellow sodium streetlights that typically lined the highway had vanished. The blackout cascaded rapidly down the rural route, plunging the entire western side of the county into pitch blackness. Bradley had successfully drawn so much raw amperage that he dragged the local substation down with him. The heavy wooden front door of the farmhouse slammed open violently. Bradley stumbled out onto the wet porch holding a bright tactical flashlight. He was drenched in rain, instantly screaming obscenities into the howling wind. His entire illicit operation hinged on constant, uninterrupted processing power. Every single minute of operational downtime was bleeding his offshore accounts dry. He paced frantically across the flooded lawn, his expensive track shoes sinking deep into the Tennessee mud. He pointed the glaring flashlight beam wildly around the yard until the harsh white circle illuminated the massive green county transformer box positioned near the main property line. Jonas watched the frantic, desperate geometry of the scene unfold. Bradley did not call the local utility company to report the catastrophic outage. He completely bypassed any rational or legal solution. He sprinted back into the dark house and emerged seconds later wielding a solid steel crowbar. He charged recklessly across the slippery grass directly toward the heavy green electrical box. The transformer was clearly marked with high-voltage warning labels and secured by a thick federal utility padlock. Bradley ignored the explicit danger entirely. He wedged the heavy steel crowbar violently into the locking mechanism. He leaned his entire body weight against the metal bar, grunting loudly over the pouring rain. The thick steel padlock snapped with a sharp, resonant ping. Bradley tore the heavy metal casing open, exposing the highly dangerous internal circuitry. He grabbed the wet crowbar and began aggressively smashing the internal ceramic safety relays. He was desperately attempting to forcefully bypass the emergency failsafe mechanisms to manually route the raw power directly back into his house. It was an act of staggering, unbelievable idiocy. Jonas stood up from his wooden stool. He knew exactly what happened when untreated steel met raw, ungrounded voltage. Bradley jammed the metal bar deep into the primary conduit. A brilliant, blinding flash of blue electrical arcing instantly erupted from the exposed green box. A deafening, explosive boom shook the saturated ground. A massive shower of white-hot sparks sprayed violently over the wet grass, illuminating the entire front pasture. The intense electrical backlash threw Bradley violently backward. He landed hard in the deep mud, scrambling desperately away on his hands and knees. The internal wiring of the transformer instantly superheated and caught fire. Thick black chemical smoke began billowing into the stormy night sky, completely overwhelming the heavy rain. Bright orange flames licked aggressively up the sides of the metal utility casing. Bradley scrambled to his feet, completely terrified by the explosive inferno he had just intentionally ignited. He dropped the smoking steel crowbar directly into the mud. He spun around in circles, panicking wildly as the electrical fire rapidly intensified. He possessed absolutely no contingency plan for this massive, destructive failure. He had completely and thoroughly destroyed the essential county utility infrastructure in a desperate, manic attempt to salvage his fully illegal operation. Jonas simply crossed his arms over his chest. He watched the brilliant orange flames reflect clearly off the dark, wet glass of the barn window. The trap had now firmly and securely snapped shut exactly as he had perfectly engineered. The sharp, piercing wail of emergency sirens immediately sliced through the heavy thunder. The catastrophic destruction of the main utility transformer had triggered an instant automated alarm at the county dispatch center. Jonas remained standing quietly in the dark barn watching the driveway. A massive county sheriff patrol car tore around the bend, its heavy tires sliding aggressively on the wet gravel. Flashing red and blue strobe lights aggressively cut through the torrential rain, illuminating the chaotic scene in disjointed, frantic flashes. The cruiser skidded to a harsh, violent halt directly onto the flooded front lawn, stopping mere yards from the violently burning transformer. Two county officers rapidly threw their heavy doors open, stepping out into the brutal storm. Bradley stood frozen in the deep mud. He stared at the approaching law enforcement officers with wide, absolutely terrified eyes. He instantly recognized that his entire fraudulent financial empire was physically burning to the ground right in front of him. The overwhelming presence of local authority shattered his remaining composure. He aggressively kicked the smoking crowbar away from his designer shoes. He raised a shaking hand and pointed his index finger directly toward the dark silhouette of the renovated barn. He screamed hysterically over the booming thunder, claiming that the crazy old man living out back had intentionally sabotaged the electrical grid. He loudly insisted that Jonas had violently caused the massive fire in a fit of extreme senile rage. The two deputies instantly believed the frantic, aggressive accusation of the younger man. They quickly turned their unwavering, direct attention toward the barn, ignoring the true origin of the flames. They simultaneously unholstered their heavy service weapons, gripping them tightly in the freezing rain. They marched aggressively across the saturated grass, heading directly toward the heavy wooden door where Jonas waited. The heavy wooden door of the barn pushed open. Jonas stepped out into the freezing, torrential rain. He did not cower from the aggressive flashing strobe lights or the drawn weapons of the approaching deputies. He kept his hands completely empty, fully visible, and perfectly steady at his sides. The storm battered his broad shoulders, soaking his shirt instantly, but his posture remained unyielding. The two officers advanced rapidly through the thick mud, their boots splashing heavily in the flooded yard. The lead deputy halted 10 feet away, keeping his service pistol angled firmly toward the ground but entirely ready for action. The lead deputy shouted over the deafening thunder, demanding an immediate explanation. He pointed toward the blazing green metal box, aggressively questioning Jonas about the catastrophic destruction of critical county utility infrastructure. He ordered Jonas to explain why a younger man was screaming that he had intentionally sabotaged the electrical grid. The deputies expected a panicked, disoriented elder. They were fully prepared to physically restrain a dangerous suspect. Jonas merely blinked through the driving rain. He did not raise his voice or offer a frantic denial. He stood rooted in the mud, projecting absolute cold and unwavering strength. Jonas did not waste a single valuable second attempting to verbally defend himself against the hysterical accusations echoing across the flooded yard. He knew that engaging in a chaotic shouting match with a desperate liar would only validate the false narrative of a disoriented, highly combative elder. He reached smoothly inside his heavy waterproof jacket, shielding his movements from the pouring rain. He withdrew a sleek, ruggedized digital tablet sealed within a thick, protective polycarbonate case. The bright screen was already unlocked and fully active. 4 years ago, precisely when Devon began making aggressive inquiries regarding the overall value of the estate, Jonas had systematically wired the entire 50-acre property with covert, high-definition security cameras. He had disguised the small lenses within birdhouses, hollowed logs, and the high rafters of the barn. The entire system was completely off the grid, running on independent solar batteries and feeding directly into a heavily encrypted local server. Jonas took one measured step forward and extended his arm, handing the glowing tablet directly to the lead deputy. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his trained eyes scanning Jonas for any sudden aggressive movements before he holstered his service pistol and accepted the device. The second deputy kept his hand resting firmly on his weapon, watching the exchange with intense suspicion. The high-resolution night vision footage played immediately on the bright display, completely unaffected by the torrential rain splashing against the reinforced glass. The sharp black-and-white video provided an unobstructed, perfectly framed view of the main transformer box. The sheriff squinted through the storm, wiping water from his eyes to focus clearly on the crystal-clear playback. The recorded timestamp on the bottom corner of the video perfectly matched the events of the past 10 minutes. The footage explicitly captured Bradley sprinting out of the dark farmhouse, his expensive designer track shoes sliding wildly in the deep mud. It showed him violently swinging a heavy steel crowbar, repeatedly and aggressively striking the federal utility padlock until the thick metal snapped. The deputy watched in absolute stunned silence as the digital version of Bradley recklessly tore open the green metal casing, exposing the highly dangerous internal circuitry. The video provided irrefutable visual documentation of Bradley attempting to manually bypass the electrical meter. It explicitly captured the exact moment he jammed the steel tool directly into the primary conduit, desperately trying to force the raw, ungrounded utility power back into his illegal cryptocurrency mining servers. The visual evidence was completely absolute and legally damning. The footage clearly displayed the catastrophic electrical arc, the brilliant flash of blue light, and the explosive shower of sparks that instantly ignited the intense chemical fire. It showed Bradley landing hard on his back in the mud, utterly terrified, before scrambling away from the blazing inferno he had single-handedly created. Jonas stood perfectly silent, letting the raw digital truth completely dismantle the frantic lies. He watched the facial expression of the lead deputy instantly shift from aggressive suspicion to profound, hardened anger. The officer aggressively tapped the screen, replaying the exact moment of the violent spark, verifying the identity of the arsonist without a single microscopic shadow of a doubt. Bradley remained standing near the violently blazing transformer, mistakenly believing that his loud, persistent shouting had successfully turned the law enforcement officers against the old man. He crossed his arms over his soaking wet designer shirt, wearing an expression of deeply arrogant satisfaction. He assumed the deputies were simply interrogating Jonas before applying the heavy steel cuffs, eagerly anticipating the exact moment the helpless elder would be forcefully dragged away. The lead deputy forcefully and aggressively handed the tablet back to Jonas. He did not say a single word of apology to the calm old man. He simply turned his entire body toward the burning transformer, his boots locking firmly into the thick mud. The second officer mirrored his exact movement, his hand dropping away from his holstered pistol. They marched directly toward Bradley, their faces set in grim, unyielding lines of absolute authority. The digital guillotine had dropped with silent, lethal precision, entirely severing the false narrative of the desperate predator. Jonas calmly retrieved his device, watching in silence. Bradley dropped his smug smile the instant the two furious deputies stopped directly in front of him. The lead officer did not ask for a verbal statement. He aggressively snatched the soaked designer wallet protruding from the front pocket of Bradley. He pulled out the pristine state identification card and instantly read the full legal name into his shoulder-mounted radio, requesting an immediate comprehensive background check through the National Criminal Database. Bradley began to frantically stutter, stepping backward into the thick mud, desperately claiming that the situation was a massive misunderstanding. He insisted that the video was a malicious fabrication. The radio on the shoulder of the deputy crackled loudly over the driving rain. The central dispatcher responded with absolute, terrifying clarity. The federal system had instantly flagged the identity of Bradley. There was a highly active, fully expedited federal warrant out for his immediate arrest regarding a massive, multi-million-dollar wire fraud operation located in a neighboring state. Bradley froze, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic. The digital trap had successfully detonated the much larger catastrophic landmine he had been desperately running from. The lead deputy lunged forward without a single warning. He grabbed Bradley by the collar of his ruined shirt, violently spinning him around. The officer aggressively slammed the arrogant predator face first against the slick, wet hood of the idling patrol cruiser. Heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists with a sharp, metallic bite. Bradley thrashed wildly against the cold metal, completely losing his mind. The deputies forcefully shoved him toward the open rear door of the vehicle. Bradley desperately twisted his head toward the dark farmhouse, screaming the name of Megan at the top of his lungs as the heavy door slammed shut. The devastating reality of his total, permanent ruin finally crushed him. The cold gray light of pre-dawn crept slowly across the flooded asphalt of the county precinct parking lot. A sleek black luxury vehicle tore around the corner, its tires hydroplaning slightly before slamming into a reserved visitor space. The engine cut off instantly. Devin and Megan practically threw their heavy doors open, stepping out into the freezing drizzle that continued to fall over the bleak Tennessee landscape. Megan wore the exact same white trousers from the previous afternoon, now heavily wrinkled and stained near the hems. Devin looked entirely unraveled, his tailored jacket tossed carelessly over his shoulder. They hurried toward the stark concrete building, their polished city shoes splashing violently through deep, muddy puddles. They pushed through the heavy, reinforced glass doors, entering the sterile, brightly lit lobby of the busy sheriff's station. The stark fluorescent bulbs hummed continuously overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the severely scuffed linoleum floor. Megan did not hesitate or look around the bleak waiting room. She marched directly toward the elevated front desk with an aggressive, deeply entitled stride. A tired desk sergeant looked up from his bright computer monitor, calmly adjusting his thick reading glasses. Megan violently slammed her manicured hands flat against the scratched wooden counter. She loudly demanded the immediate, unconditional release of her arrested brother Bradley. She insisted his arrest was a catastrophic mistake executed by completely incompetent local deputies who simply did not understand complex corporate property rights. Her sharp voice echoed loudly off the painted cinder-block walls filled with a frantic, desperate arrogance. She explicitly threatened to sue the entire police department for wrongful imprisonment, waving her highly expensive designer handbag in the air to clearly emphasize her vast financial resources. Devin stood directly behind her, nodding in rapid, silent agreement, entirely failing to notice Jonas. Jonas sat perfectly still on a rigid plastic chair positioned in the darkest corner of the precinct waiting area. He held a steaming paper cup of black coffee in his hands, observing the chaotic meltdown unfolding just a few yards away. He had arrived hours earlier to formally finalize his comprehensive police report regarding the extensive property damage. Megan spun around violently in frustration after the desk sergeant firmly instructed her to lower her voice. Her angry gaze swept wildly across the sterile room and suddenly locked directly onto the serene face of Jonas. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated fury upon realizing the old man was physically present in the building. She abandoned the front counter, instantly marching across the scuffed floor with heavy, aggressive steps. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger right at his chest, completely ignoring the heavy presence of armed law enforcement officers surrounding them. She screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, viciously calling him a paranoid, senile fool. She falsely shrieked that he had intentionally sabotaged his own electrical grid out of pure spite, simply to frame her entirely innocent brother. Devin trailed behind her, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, looking nervously between his stoic father and the observing officers. Jonas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to counter the vicious, deeply unhinged accusations echoing through the lobby. He took a slow, methodical sip from his paper cup. Megan spun back toward the desk sergeant. She violently unzipped her oversized handbag and forcefully withdrew the crisp, durable power of attorney document she had aggressively pressured Jonas into signing just yesterday. She slapped the heavy legal parchment violently onto the high desk, demanding absolute immediate compliance. She commanded the sergeant to officially recognize the medical paperwork and immediately take Jonas into involuntary psychiatric custody. She claimed the old man was an active physical danger to himself and others, citing the raging transformer fire as undeniable proof of his severe extreme dementia. She then loudly dictated that she and Devin now possessed total, unrestricted legal control over his entire financial estate and all associated business holdings. She ordered the officers to immediately process an emergency bail payment for Bradley, utilizing the newly seized assets belonging to her father-in-law. Her aggressive plan was deeply horrific. She fully intended to throw Jonas into a locked mental institution and directly drain his retirement funds to physically purchase the freedom of the man who had just destroyed his property. She stood tall with absolute triumphant confidence, glaring down at the police sergeant as if she owned the entire building. She believed she had successfully executed a flawless, lethal checkmate against a vulnerable, defenseless target. Devin swallowed hard, completely unable to meet the piercing, steady gaze of his father. Jonas simply crossed one leg over the other. He recognized the exact moment a predator blindly walked straight into the steel teeth of a deeply buried snare. He remained absolutely quiet and perfectly composed. The county sheriff slowly stepped out from a back office. He walked calmly behind the elevated desk, his heavy utility belt creaking slightly with every step. He picked up the pristine legal document Megan had forcefully presented. The entire room plunged into total suffocating silence as the ranking law enforcement officer began meticulously reading the binding clauses printed on the crisp, heavy paper. He scanned the fraudulent physician stamp located near the bottom edge. He intensely examined the jagged, trembling signature executing the brutal transfer of power. Megan tapped her designer shoe impatiently, awaiting her total victory, blissfully unaware of reality. The county sheriff lowered the document and let out a deep, booming laugh that completely shattered the tense silence. He tossed the worthless paper back onto the counter with absolute contempt. He informed Megan that the rigid federal legal system had already automatically flagged the left-handed signature as a strictly invalid criminal forgery many hours ago. He explicitly detailed the ironclad biometric mandate Jonas had legally established 10 years prior. Devin instantly froze in pure, paralyzing terror, realizing their elaborate medical extortion plot was entirely dead. Megan gasped, her jaw dropping in profound, utter disbelief. Desperate to salvage the rapidly collapsing situation, she aggressively pulled out her heavy corporate platinum credit card. She shoved the shiny plastic directly at the desk sergeant, furiously demanding to personally pay the exorbitant bail required to free Bradley immediately. The sergeant calmly swiped the premium card through the aging terminal. The machine beeped harshly, instantly flashing a bright red digital decline notification. Megan shrieked violently, ordering the officer to quickly run it again. The machine blared a second definitive rejection. The sheriff leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on the desk. He informed her with a grim, brutal finality that a powerful state fraud investigator had officially frozen every single corporate account associated with her media agency shortly after midnight. He revealed that the state medical board had proactively forwarded an anonymous audio file detailing a massive extortion conspiracy. Megan staggered backward, the devastating reality of total financial annihilation physically crushing the breath completely out of her chest. She slowly turned her head, locking eyes directly with Jonas. He raised his simple paper coffee cup slightly into the air, offering her a completely silent, devastatingly polite toast. The quiet execution of the predator was now entirely, flawlessly complete. What happens next changes absolutely everything. The drive back to the farmhouse passed in a suffocating and absolute silence. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the Tennessee landscape choked in a thick, oppressive humidity. Megan sat rigidly in the passenger seat of the luxury SUV, her knuckles completely white as she gripped her worthless designer handbag. Her media empire was frozen. Her brother was locked in a federal holding cell, and her perfect reality was actively burning to the ground. Devin gripped the steering wheel with a manic, desperate energy, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground audibly together. Jonas sat perfectly composed in the back seat, watching the passing wet trees without a single ounce of pity. The vehicle crested the final hill and aggressively turned into the long gravel driveway. The massive charred remains of the utility transformer still sat smoking slightly near the property line, a dark monument to the absolute destruction of their illegal operation. Devin slammed the brakes, bringing the heavy vehicle to a violent halt near the main porch. He killed the engine and aggressively shoved his door open, marching toward the front steps with heavy, angry strides. He stopped completely dead in his tracks before his foot even touched the wooden stairs. Affixed directly to the center of the solid oak front door was a thick, highly visible plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a stark, bright red document printed on heavy stock paper. It was a formal, aggressively expedited official notice of immediate commercial bank foreclosure. Devin let out a guttural, furious roar that tore through the quiet rural property. He lunged forcefully up the wooden steps and violently ripped the plastic sleeve directly off the solid oak door. He tore the heavy paper out of its protective casing, his eyes scanning the bold legal print with absolute unchecked terror. The catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He aggressively crumpled the primary sheet in his fist and spun around to face Jonas, who was now calmly stepping out of the back seat of the vehicle. Devin marched directly toward his father, his face contorted into an ugly, vicious mask of pure, desperate rage. He violently pointed his shaking index finger right at the stoic face of his aging father, loudly and aggressively blaming Jonas for the entire massive disaster. Devin shrieked that the unnecessary presence of the county police during the transformer fire had directly triggered an emergency automated alert within the commercial banking system. He aggressively detailed how the New York bank had immediately dispatched a regional field inspector to assess the physical collateral, leading to the instant discovery of the massive, entirely illegal cryptocurrency mining operation hidden inside the residential farmhouse. Devin screamed that the unauthorized industrial server farm constituted a massive, unmitigated breach of the strict commercial loan agreement. Megan stepped slowly out of the dark luxury vehicle, her face incredibly pale and entirely drained of its usual arrogant color. She stood silently on the wet gravel, watching her husband completely unravel. Devin was hyperventilating aggressively, waving the crumpled foreclosure notice in the humid air. He loudly stated that the massive financial institution was actively accelerating the total debt collection process. He screamed that they required an immediate payment of $400,000 by the absolute end of the business day, or they would aggressively seize the entire 50-acre estate and instantly initiate devastating criminal fraud proceedings against him. The profound arrogance that had fueled Devin for years was entirely gone, completely replaced by the pathetic whining of a cornered predator. He aggressively closed the distance between himself and his father, stopping mere inches from the chest of Jonas. Devin completely abandoned his previously manufactured and utterly fake facade of loving concern. He violently ordered his father to immediately contact his retirement fund manager and entirely liquidate his lifelong pension accounts. Devin explicitly and extremely loudly demanded that Jonas instantly wire him the full cash balance to permanently erase the massive, suffocating commercial bank debt. He screamed that Jonas owed him this total financial sacrifice, arrogantly insisting that family must always protect family, regardless of the ultimate cost. He commanded Jonas to empty his entire life savings to successfully cover the catastrophic consequences of their massive, unforgivable theft. Jonas simply stood absolutely motionless on the cold, damp gravel. He did not flinch away from the aggressive physical proximity of his son. He did not show an ounce of intimidation or fear in the face of the violent, desperate shouting. He stared directly into the wide, panicked eyes of Devin, observing the absolute moral bankruptcy of the man standing before him. Devin was actively demanding that his father willingly step directly into the fire to shield the very people who had deliberately pushed him into the flames. Jonas did not raise his voice to argue. He did not bother pointing out the staggering hypocrisy of demanding ultimate family loyalty from the exact same man they had just aggressively attempted to throw into a locked psychiatric facility. Jonas simply maintained his perfectly steady, unyielding posture, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying calm. The complete and unyielding silence of Jonas infuriated Devin even further. He aggressively demanded an instant verbal answer, screaming wildly and very aggressively into the perfectly quiet, humid afternoon air, utterly and completely failing to comprehend that the absolute battlefield had already drastically shifted permanently underneath his expensive shoes. Jonas did not engage with the violently chaotic and completely unhinged temper tantrum happening right in front of him. He simply stepped gracefully around his loudly screaming son and walked deliberately toward the wooden front porch to collect the discarded paper. The second page of the thick bank document had fluttered to the damp floorboards when Devin aggressively ripped the plastic sleeve apart. Jonas bent down smoothly, completely ignoring the frantic noise behind him, and carefully retrieved the heavy, water-resistant paper directly from the wet, dark wood of the porch. He stood up completely straight, cleared his throat, and read the crisp, bold print incredibly loudly, ensuring his voice carried perfectly over the tense, humid air. He explicitly announced that the commercial bank had completely and officially nullified the entire business mortgage. The federal lending institution explicitly stated that the 50-acre property could not be legally utilized as corporate collateral under any circumstances. Jonas calmly continued reading, his voice entirely devoid of mercy. He then explicitly revealed that the massive bank's internal fraud department had aggressively flagged the primary guarantor's signature as an absolute confirmed forgery. The advanced biometric security systems had actively rejected the clumsy left-handed signature stroke instantly. Devin stopped screaming entirely, his mouth hanging open in pure, suffocating horror. His knees buckled slightly as the absolute gravity of the brutal situation finally crushed him. He had intentionally orchestrated a massive federal banking fraud, desperately attempting to steal his father's entire estate, and he had completely and totally failed. Devin immediately stared blankly down at the cold, wet gravel, entirely and utterly paralyzed by the incredibly terrifying realization that he had just aggressively committed a severe, highly documented felony for absolutely nothing. The massive legal trap had officially and permanently closed tightly around his now completely exposed neck. The crunch of tires against wet gravel broke the heavy silence gripping the yard. A silver sedan rolled smoothly up the driveway, navigating around the deep, muddy ruts left by the sheriff. The vehicle came to a precise halt behind the luxury SUV. The door opened and Attorney Hayes stepped out into the humid air. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that remained immaculate despite the oppressive dampness clinging to the farm. In his right hand, he carried a black leather briefcase. He adjusted his glasses and surveyed the chaotic scene with the detached clinical efficiency of a surgeon preparing to operate. Devin and Megan stood frozen on the porch, their faces pale masks of terror and confusion. Megan opened her mouth to speak, desperate to assert her usual aggressive authority, but Hayes completely and utterly ignored her existence. He did not offer a polite greeting or acknowledge the panicked couple standing a few feet away. His sharp, calculating eyes locked exclusively onto Jonas. He walked past Devin and Megan as if they were entirely invisible, treating them like irrelevant ghosts haunting a property they failed to steal. He stopped beside his car and rested his briefcase flat against the hood. Hayes snapped the dual locks on his briefcase with a sharp metallic click. He flipped the lid open and retrieved a stack of watermarked documents. He spread the original property deeds carefully across the polished hood of his sedan, arranging them in a meticulous, deliberate sequence. The white pages starkly contrasted with the charred ruins of the electrical transformer smoking in the background. Jonas remained absolutely silent, stepping forward to stand beside his fiercely loyal attorney. Devin slowly descended the wooden porch stairs, his arrogant posture completely shattered, his expensive shoes dragging heavily through the wet gravel. He approached the vehicle with a sickening dread pooling deep within his stomach. He stared down at the dense legal text, unable to comprehend the complex, ironclad framework staring back at him. Hayes did not offer a comforting explanation. He delivered the absolute devastating reality with brutal cold and entirely clinical precision. He tapped a manicured finger directly onto the primary residential deed, forcing Devin to look at the exact wording of the ownership clause. Hayes explicitly clarified the catastrophic legal boundaries of the estate. He stated that the name of Devin was permanently and exclusively attached solely to the physical structure of the farmhouse. Devin owned the wood, the drywall, the shingles, and the glass. He did not own a single microscopic fraction of the earth resting beneath the foundation. Hayes sharply moved his finger to the expansive document resting beside the residential deed. He loudly declared that the entire 50 acres of surrounding prime agricultural land belonged exclusively to an impenetrable corporate entity known as Evelyn Holdings. Devin desperately rubbed his trembling hands over his pale face, struggling to breathe in the suffocating humidity. He rejected the information, aggressively insisting that he had paid the property taxes and funded the recent kitchen renovations. He shrieked that his financial contributions guaranteed him total ownership of the entire parcel. Hayes adjusted his glasses and stared at the desperate man with absolute unwavering contempt. He explained that paying for cosmetic upgrades inside a structure did not grant a person the legal right to seize the underlying acreage. Evelyn Holdings was a deeply fortified generational trust constructed specifically to repel hostile financial takeovers. The trust was fully, permanently, and exclusively governed by Jonas. Devin possessed absolutely no voting power, no executive authority, and zero legal capacity to leverage the dirt beneath his boots. Hayes dissected the undeniable stupidity of the commercial banking fraud. Devin had aggressively marched into a major New York financial institution and pledged 50 acres of prime Tennessee real estate as unyielding collateral for a commercial bailout loan. However, Devin had arrogantly attempted to pledge a massive asset that he entirely did not own. He had utilized a completely worthless residential structure deed to fraudulently misrepresent his vast personal wealth. The bank relied entirely upon his forged guarantor signature to validate the immense transaction, assuming Jonas had willingly pledged the corporate land to rescue his failing son. Hayes pointed at the exact line detailing the corporate ownership structure. He stated that Devin had effectively attempted to sell a stolen car to a federal bank right in front of the actual legal owner. Megan rushed down the steps, her hair sticking wildly to her sweating forehead. She leaned over the hood of the sedan, her eyes scanning the watermarked trust documents with unadulterated panic. She demanded to know why this corporate entity remained entirely hidden from their financial background checks. Hayes offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. He informed her that Evelyn Holdings was publicly registered with the state for over a decade. They had simply been far too arrogant, entirely too lazy, and completely blinded by their ravenous greed to read the actual county ground lease before executing a federal crime. They actively assumed Jonas was a naive farmer who lacked the basic intellectual capacity to protect his own legacy. They confidently bet their entire financial future on his absolute vulnerability. Instead, they forcefully threw themselves headfirst into a highly engineered, totally inescapable legal meat grinder. The reality of their total permanent destruction settled heavily over the damp driveway. Devin stared at the crisp white pages, his lungs heaving desperately as he realized the terrifying magnitude of the absolute nightmare he actively created. Hayes was entirely finished dismantling their massive financial fraud right now. He reached across the polished hood of his silver sedan and deliberately tapped his index finger against a highly specific, deeply buried penalty clause highlighted in bold black ink at the absolute bottom of the primary ground lease. He aggressively demanded that Devin read the binding text aloud. Devin remained completely frozen, his jaw trembling violently, utterly unable to process the final fatal blow. Hayes read it for him, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority over the wet property. He explained that the corporate trust explicitly dictated that any unauthorized attempt to independently mortgage the physical structure or the facilitation of any illegal, highly destructive commercial activity on the immediate premises constituted a catastrophic and total violation of the underlying lease agreement. By intentionally destroying the county utility grid to aggressively power a massive, fraudulent cryptocurrency mining operation, Devin had actively triggered the exact fail-safe mechanism Jonas had patiently waited for. The heavily fortified trust mandated absolute and immediate legal forfeiture as the sole penalty for such a massive breach. The physical structure of the farmhouse instantly reverted completely back into the ironclad possession of Evelyn Holdings. The absolute reality of the devastating counterstrike finally broke through the blinding panic clouding the mind of Devin. He had arrogantly believed he was aggressively seizing a vast multi-million-dollar estate from a weak, completely defenseless, and entirely broken old man. Instead, he had meticulously orchestrated his own total, permanent obliteration. He did not own the sprawling acreage. He did not possess the extremely valuable mineral rights. Now he did not even legally own the drywall, the floors, or the glass windows he stood behind. Devin stared blankly at his father, fully realizing he owned absolutely nothing here at all today. Megan stared at the crisp white pages resting on the polished hood of the silver sedan. The absolute reality of her sudden eviction crashed into her consciousness, instantly replacing her shock with pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward with sudden, violent energy. Her manicured hands aggressively snatched the original property deeds and trust documents right off the metal surface. She did not bother reading a single printed word. She began violently tearing the heavy watermarked paper into tiny, jagged shreds. She screamed wildly into the humid Tennessee air, throwing the ruined pieces of the legal documents directly into the deep, muddy puddles surrounding the driveway. Attorney Hayes did not flinch or attempt to stop her destructive tantrum. He calmly watched her destroy the physical copies, projecting total indifference. He possessed digital backups and highly secure master files locked safely inside a downtown vault. Destroying the paper achieved absolutely nothing but displaying her profound lack of control. Megan aggressively dug into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out her sleek mobile phone. Her hands shook violently as she aggressively stabbed the touchscreen, dialing the direct private number of her elite corporate attorney located in the city. She paced frantically back and forth across the wet gravel, her high heels sinking deeply into the thick mud. She aggressively hit the speakerphone button, demanding maximum volume so Jonas could hear her impending victory. She screamed into the microphone, wildly demanding an immediate emergency legal injunction against her father-in-law. She shrieked that Jonas and his corrupt local lawyer were actively attempting a highly illegal, fraudulent, hostile takeover of her marital assets. She explicitly ordered her city attorney to instantly freeze the generational trust and legally force Jonas to surrender the entire property directly back to her husband Devin today without delay. The deep, heavily strained voice of the corporate attorney echoed sharply from the small speaker of the mobile phone, cutting through the thick humidity of the rural property. He did not offer a polite greeting or attempt to calm the frantic, screaming woman. He delivered his response with cold, absolute, and entirely devastating professional detachment. He explicitly commanded Megan to stop speaking immediately and listen carefully to the catastrophic legal reality currently unfolding inside his downtown office. He firmly stated that obtaining a civil injunction against the generational trust was entirely impossible and completely irrelevant right now. The severe crisis they were facing had absolutely nothing to do with residential property disputes or local family court proceedings. The attorney explicitly revealed that the massive commercial bank in New York had not simply canceled the highly fraudulent mortgage application. They had actively triggered a massive, automated federal response protocol. He detailed how the financial institution possessed irrefutable forensic evidence that Devin had knowingly submitted a completely forged guarantor signature to illegally secure $400,000 in commercial credit. The banking executives had aggressively escalated the massive felony directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation before dawn today. Megan stopped pacing entirely. Her expensive shoes remained locked in the thick mud as the blood completely drained from her face. Devin stood paralyzed near the front porch, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The city attorney continued his brutal, unrelenting explanation over the loudspeakerphone. He explicitly outlined the exact trajectory of the stolen funds. He revealed that Devin had not simply held the fraudulent bank money in a standard local checking account. He had aggressively and immediately wired the entire $400,000 directly into the offshore cryptocurrency exchange accounts entirely managed by Bradley. This specific, highly documented financial transfer constituted a massive, extremely severe federal crime. Because the illegally obtained commercial funds had intentionally crossed state lines and entered an unregistered digital financial network, the jurisdiction instantly shifted from a local fraud charge to a massive federal investigation. The undeniable digital paper trail was permanently cemented in the banking system, leaving absolutely zero room for plausible deniability. The attorney heavily emphasized the absolute undeniable severity of the situation. He explicitly informed Megan and Devin that they were no longer dealing with a simple banking error or a local property disagreement. They were now the primary targets of a highly active, fully mobilized federal wire fraud and money laundering investigation. The Department of Justice was actively constructing a massive criminal case against them right at this very second. The lawyer revealed that federal agents had already aggressively raided the downtown media agency offices, seizing all corporate hard drives, communication logs, and financial ledgers. He explicitly advised Megan that her complete financial ruin was no longer a future possibility, but an absolute, undeniable current reality. He firmly instructed her to cease all immediate contact with him, explicitly stating that his prestigious firm was formally dropping her as a client due to the massive federal criminal exposure. He aggressively warned them both not to attempt to flee the state, as federal warrants were highly likely to be issued before the end of the business day. The line went completely dead with a sharp, heavy click. The devastating silence that followed was heavier than the torrential storm that had passed through earlier. The absolute magnitude of their total destruction was finally comprehensively clear. They had intentionally tried to steal a simple farm, and in the very process, they had actively triggered the full crushing weight of the federal government directly onto their own exposed heads. Megan stood completely frozen on the wet gravel driveway, her manicured hand hovering uselessly in the humid air. The heavy mobile phone slipped from her loosened grip and dropped violently onto the damp earth, the expensive glass screen shattering instantly against a sharp stone. She did not look down at the broken device. She slowly turned her head, fixing her wide, terrified eyes entirely upon her husband. The profound, unadulterated realization of her complete permanent ruin completely shattered her carefully manufactured corporate composure. She forcefully lunged across the short distance separating them and aggressively slapped Devin hard across the face. The sharp, violent crack of her hand striking his cheek echoed loudly across the quiet 50-acre property. She viciously cursed him, screaming at the top of her lungs that he was a completely useless, pathetic failure who had intentionally dragged her directly into a massive federal prison sentence. Devin absorbed the physical blow without making a single sound. He remained entirely paralyzed near the wooden porch, his deeply arrogant facade fully and permanently destroyed. The slick city businessman was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken shell of a man facing the absolute end of his entire existence. His shallow breathing hitched violently in his chest as he slowly turned his red, stinging face away from his screaming wife. He looked directly at Jonas, standing calmly near the silver sedan. Devin silently pleaded with his eyes desperately begging his father for a miraculous rescue from the catastrophic federal nightmare he had explicitly engineered. Jonas simply looked at his son for one long, utterly silent second. He did not offer a single word of comfort, mercy, or forgiveness. Jonas turned his back on the pathetic scene and walked slowly, deliberately into the dark shadows of the renovated barn. The suffocating humidity of the late afternoon rapidly deteriorated into a violently oppressive evening as the heavy Tennessee sky completely blackened. Night fell with a brutal and sudden intensity, completely swallowing the sprawling 50-acre property in absolute pitch darkness. The torrential rainstorm that had temporarily paused earlier in the day resumed with a terrifying, unrelenting violence. Thick, freezing sheets of water hammered viciously against the metal roof of the renovated barn, creating a deafening mechanical roar that drowned out the distant rumbling of thunder. The wind howled aggressively across the flooded pastures, whipping the heavy rain into sharp, stinging projectiles. Devin stumbled blindly through the absolute darkness of the ruined yard. The luxury SUV was completely gone. Megan had aggressively demanded an immediate divorce and sped away hours ago, leaving him entirely stranded in the freezing downpour. His tailored city suit was entirely soaked through, clinging heavily to his shivering, pathetic frame. His expensive leather shoes slipped wildly in the deep, churning mud left behind by the departed patrol cruisers. He dragged himself forcefully toward the towering silhouette of the barn. A single warm yellow light glowed faintly from a small window near the heavy wooden doors, offering the only remaining beacon of hope in his totally shattered universe. Devin threw his entire body weight against the solid oak barrier. He raised his freezing, mud-caked hands and began violently pounding his clenched fists against the thick, unyielding wood. The rough timber scraped the skin from his knuckles, but he completely ignored the sharp physical pain. The freezing rain washed heavily down his pale, terrified face, mixing freely with his desperate, flowing tears. He aggressively slammed his palms against the doorframe, screaming over the deafening roar of the raging thunderstorm. His voice cracked with pure, unadulterated desperation as he begged for shelter from the brutal elements. He violently banged his clenched fists again, very loudly, screaming the word "Dad" into the freezing wind for the very first time in 5 long, arrogant years. He frantically pleaded for his aging father to quickly show him total unconditional mercy right now, tonight. Devin leaned his exhausted forehead directly against the rough, freezing timber of the heavy barn door. He rapidly gasped for air, actively choking on his own flowing tears and the relentless driving rain. He began shouting wildly through the thick wood, projecting his panicked voice directly into the dry, secure sanctuary where Jonas quietly waited. Devin aggressively shifted the entire blame for the catastrophic federal wire fraud disaster directly onto the absent shoulders of his departed wife. He frantically screamed that Megan was the true criminal mastermind behind the incredibly destructive financial plot. He loudly insisted that she had viciously manipulated him into physically executing the massive fraudulent commercial loan. Devin shrieked that Megan had aggressively threatened to completely divorce him and entirely ruin his fragile corporate reputation if he did not willingly forge the guarantor signature to forcefully secure the massive banking capital. He desperately painted himself as a completely helpless, entirely innocent victim who simply succumbed to relentless, brutal marital extortion. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of his pathetic lies echoed sharply across the flooded, pitch-black property. Devin completely erased his own arrogant, deeply malicious agency. He fully ignored the undeniable, absolute reality that he had personally and intentionally orchestrated the severe legal assault against his own father. Devin slowly slid his soaking wet hands down the massive wooden barrier, losing the last microscopic ounce of his remaining physical strength. He violently dropped completely to his bruised knees, sinking heavily into the freezing, deep Tennessee mud. The filthy water instantly soaked through the expensive fabric of his ruined tailored trousers, chilling his entire body to the absolute bone. He aggressively clawed at the wet earth, totally abandoning every remaining shred of his deeply manufactured corporate pride. Devin tilted his head backward, looking blindly up into the raging, punishing thunderstorm, and began begging with a pure, unadulterated, sickening desperation. He wildly ordered Jonas to immediately authorize a massive emergency cash withdrawal directly from the deeply buried, heavily fortified accounts of Evelyn Holdings. He screamed that the generational trust contained more than enough liquid capital to instantly erase the $400,000 commercial debt and permanently satisfy the aggressive federal investigators. He shrieked that Jonas possessed the ultimate legal power to single-handedly stop the impending, totally devastating criminal indictment. He repeatedly shouted that the highly active FBI agents would entirely halt their massive criminal probe if the original stolen funds were quickly and completely restored to the commercial bank immediately. Devin aggressively wept into the dark storm, loudly demanding that his father willingly sacrifice the entire generational legacy to physically block his deeply arrogant son from entering a cold, federal prison cell. He frantically commanded Jonas to blindly clean up the massive, catastrophic wreckage of his entirely selfish, thoroughly malicious ambition. The brutal freezing rain battered his shaking shoulders as he violently pounded the muddy ground with his raw fists. He aggressively promised to completely disappear forever if Jonas would just legally authorize the massive financial wire transfer right now. He sobbed uncontrollably into the freezing rain, completely ignoring the absolute fact that he had spent the entire past week aggressively trying to steal that exact same fortified trust fund by forcing his father into a locked psychiatric ward. The dark storm violently drowned out his pathetic, completely hypocritical wailing. The heavy iron latch suddenly scraped loudly from within the barn, instantly silencing the frantic screaming of the broken predator. The massive wooden door swung slowly inward, cutting a sharp, brilliant wedge of bright yellow light across the flooded, pitch-black driveway. Jonas stood silently framed in the warm doorway, perfectly dry and entirely composed. He did not extend a loving hand to pull his shivering son out from the freezing Tennessee mud. He simply looked down at the pathetic, completely shattered shell of the arrogant man he had raised. Jonas smoothly reached behind the heavy doorframe and calmly retrieved a dark, soaked object. He tossed it forward with absolute, entirely merciless precision. The heavy, waterlogged fabric of Devin's discarded, expensive tailored coat landed with a loud, wet slap directly onto the churning mud right beside his bruised knees. Jonas stared coldly into the wide, utterly terrified eyes of his son. He spoke with a quiet, devastatingly brutal authority that instantly cut entirely through the howling storm. Jonas explicitly reminded Devin of the exact unforgivable moment just 1 week ago when he had aggressively ordered his own aging father to permanently vacate the farmhouse simply to harbor a wanted federal fugitive and a massive illegal cryptocurrency operation. Jonas stated clearly that true family does not maliciously execute hostile takeovers against their own blood. He stated that the absolute consequences of federal fraud were now exclusively his alone to blindly navigate. Jonas took one slow, deliberate step backward into the warm, illuminated interior of the secure barn. He stared deeply into the dark, punishing void for one final second. He firmly gripped the thick iron handle and pulled the massive oak door shut. The heavy deadbolt slid loudly into place with a sharp, brutal finality, abandoning Devin in the freezing, absolute darkness. Megan had not driven far. She had parked her luxury sedan at the edge of the county road, frantically realizing her frozen credit cards meant she possessed absolutely no means to buy gasoline or secure a hotel room. She had aggressively trudged back through the mud, dragging her heavy designer luggage toward the main farmhouse just as Devin was violently rejected from the barn. The harsh roar of a heavy diesel engine violently sliced through the deafening sound of the relentless thunderstorm. Devin had forcefully shattered the glass of the utility lockbox inside the main mudroom, successfully securing the spare set of keys to the massive heavy-duty pickup truck belonging to Jonas. The massive vehicle idled aggressively in the flooded driveway, its bright halogen headlights cutting a stark white path through the freezing driving rain. Devin and Megan furiously threw their soaked, incredibly expensive leather luggage directly into the open, rusted bed of the farm truck. They were entirely operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and blinding panic. Their singular, desperate objective was to immediately flee the county jurisdiction before the impending federal warrants officially dropped into the local law enforcement database. Devin scrambled aggressively into the driver's seat, his wet clothes soaking the worn upholstery. Megan forcefully slammed the heavy passenger door shut, locking it instantly. The cold interior of the truck smelled faintly of motor oil and wet earth, a harsh contrast to the pristine leather of the luxury vehicles they had permanently lost. Devin gripped the thick steering wheel, his knuckles entirely white, completely ignoring the absolute reality that stealing a registered vehicle would drastically multiply their existing legal devastation. He aggressively jammed the heavy transmission into gear, violently slamming his foot directly down onto the accelerator pedal to initiate their desperate escape incredibly fast right now tonight. The massive heavy-duty tires of the agricultural pickup truck spun wildly in the thick Tennessee mud before finally finding solid traction on the underlying gravel driveway. Devin aggressively steered the heavy vehicle toward the main county road, the powerful diesel engine roaring furiously into the pitch-black night. He stared blindly through the actively swishing windshield wipers, his entire body shaking violently with absolute unchecked terror. The wide illuminated path of the bright halogen headlights perfectly framed the towering wrought iron security gates positioned precisely at the primary edge of the sprawling 50-acre generational estate. Devin violently slammed his muddy foot directly down onto the metal floorboard, aggressively commanding maximum acceleration from the massive roaring engine. The heavy truck forcefully surged forward through the torrential freezing downpour, rapidly closing the remaining physical distance to absolute complete freedom. Megan sat rigidly in the passenger seat, gripping the dashboard with white knuckles, frantically praying that they could successfully cross the invisible legal jurisdiction line before the relentless federal authorities officially closed the absolute dragnet. The heavy truck aggressively barreled directly toward the imposing iron barrier. The powerful diesel engine was screaming loudly, actively pushing the speedometer higher and higher into the red margin. Suddenly, precisely as the heavy front bumper physically breached the final concrete boundary perimeter marker, the massive engine violently sputtered. A sharp, terrifying mechanical clicking noise completely overwhelmed the interior cabin. The dashboard lights instantly flickered wildly before dying completely in absolute total darkness. The powerful engine entirely completely shut down, aggressively choking on a forced absolute fuel starvation protocol. The heavy truck violently lunged forward on pure raw momentum, completely losing all functional power steering and vital braking assist capabilities. Devin desperately wrestled with the heavy, lifeless steering wheel, violently pumping the dead brake pedal with his soaking wet foot. The heavy truck aggressively skidded wildly across the completely saturated gravel, violently sliding sideways before slamming heavily into a deep, muddy ditch located directly parallel to the unyielding iron gates. The heavy wrought iron perimeter gates, previously resting wide open, suddenly engaged with a loud, aggressive mechanical whine. The thick steel doors smoothly swung entirely shut, forcefully locking together with a massive, sharp metallic clank that completely severed their desperate escape route. Devin aggressively punched the lifeless steering wheel, screaming wildly into the silent, frozen cabin. He desperately twisted the ignition key, but the engine remained totally, absolutely dead. He violently shoved his heavy door open, stepping out into the freezing, relentless storm. He turned his head and stared aggressively back up the long, dark driveway. Jonas stood perfectly calm on the illuminated wooden porch of the main farmhouse, completely shielded from the freezing, driving rain. Jonas held a sleek digital smart home remote securely in his steady right hand. The bright screen glowed softly in the dark. 4 years ago, when Devin first began actively displaying dangerous financial arrogance, Jonas had thoroughly upgraded the estate security network. He had systematically wired the primary agricultural truck with a highly advanced military-grade digital immobilizer directly synced to the perimeter boundary system. He had explicitly programmed the heavy vehicle to instantly completely shut down its core fuel injectors the exact second it physically crossed the main iron gates without receiving his own specific authorized biometric thumbprint scan. The silent digital trap had successfully executed its absolute flawless protocol. Jonas simply lowered the glowing remote, entirely ignoring the frantic, desperate screaming of his completely trapped son. Devin aggressively pounded his raw fists violently against the locked iron gates, aggressively demanding his immediate release right now, safely here tonight. Suddenly, a blinding barrage of intensely bright red and vibrant blue strobe lights violently cut directly through the pitch-black darkness of the main county highway. 4 massive, heavily armored federal tactical vehicles aggressively swerved off the slick asphalt, violently skidding onto the gravel shoulder. They rapidly formed an impenetrable semicircular barricade directly outside the locked iron gates, their intense high beams perfectly illuminating the completely trapped, heavily damaged farm truck. Devin spun around his chest, heaving violently, his eyes completely wide with absolute, unadulterated terror as heavily armed federal agents poured aggressively out of the dark vehicles. Megan sat completely paralyzed inside the dead truck, entirely unable to physically process the sheer devastating reality of the catastrophic situation. By intentionally attempting to violently flee a highly active federal jurisdiction, utilizing a formally unregistered explicitly stolen motor vehicle. They had successfully elevated their severe commercial fraud charges into immediate catastrophic federal flight offenses. The massive iron gates suddenly unlocked and smoothly swung open, activated remotely by the silent old man watching patiently from the distant wooden porch. The heavily armed federal agents aggressively flooded into the muddy property, their powerful tactical flashlights violently piercing the driving rain. A booming, completely unforgiving voice echoed sharply through a heavy digital bullhorn, aggressively ordering both Devon and Megan to immediately exit the stolen vehicle with their hands entirely visible and completely empty in the air. Devon slowly raised his shaking hands, fully realizing his deeply arrogant, entirely fraudulent corporate empire had successfully ended directly at the very end of a cold, muddy gunpoint. They had completely and utterly destroyed their entire lives for absolutely nothing. The massive digital trap had finally snapped completely shut, leaving them entirely paralyzed within the terrifying absolute reality of a deeply deserved and fully inescapable permanent prison sentence. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the federal interrogation room fluorescent lights beat down mercilessly on the cold steel table. The sterile environment smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the luxurious fragrances Megan was accustomed to breathing. She sat rigidly on a stiff metal chair, her previously immaculate designer clothing now damp, heavily wrinkled, and smeared with dark Tennessee mud. Her expensive makeup had completely melted down her pale face, leaving dark tracks of ruined mascara streaking across her hollow cheeks. She sat directly across from a stone-faced federal agent wearing a crisp, dark suit. The agent projected an aura of absolute, terrifying indifference, completely unaffected by her frantic tears or her wealthy background. He slid a thick stack of blank federal confession forms across the polished steel surface. Megan did not hesitate or ask for a moment of quiet reflection. Her manicured fingers, shaking violently from the lingering adrenaline of the violent roadside arrest, gripped a cheap plastic pen with desperate white-knuckled intensity. She began writing her official statement with a frantic, completely unhinged speed. The heavy silence of the soundproof room was broken only by the sharp, rapid scratching of her pen against the thick government paper. She completely abandoned her arrogant corporate facade. The terrifying reality of a permanent federal prison sentence had entirely broken her spirit. She was now acting entirely on pure primal survival instinct, aggressively preparing to sacrifice the only person left in her ruined life to save herself. Megan aggressively pushed the completed pages across the cold steel table, entirely throwing her husband under the massive federal bus without a single ounce of hesitation or marital loyalty. She frantically explained to the silent investigator that she possessed absolutely no prior knowledge regarding the massive commercial banking fraud. She explicitly and repeatedly claimed that Devon had entirely fabricated the forged guarantor signature in total secrecy. She carefully painted a truly pathetic, entirely fictional, and wholly desperate narrative of herself as a completely oblivious spouse who was actively kept in the dark regarding the illegal cryptocurrency mining operation hidden within the rural barn. She very loudly insisted that Bradley was exclusively a business associate of Devon, entirely minimizing her own direct biological relationship to the arrested fugitive. She demanded absolute immediate federal immunity, aggressively offering to act as the primary star witness for the prosecution. She promised to deliver every single hidden password and secret offshore account number associated with the corrupt media agency, entirely trading the total permanent destruction of her husband for a highly coveted, strictly negotiated plea deal. Simultaneously, directly through the thick concrete wall in the adjacent holding cell, an incredibly similar scene of absolute ruthless betrayal was actively unfolding. Devon sat slumped over an identical cold steel table, entirely broken and sweating profusely under the harsh federal lights. He did not ask to consult with an attorney or attempt to shield his wife from the massive impending legal fallout. He desperately shoved his unlocked mobile phone directly toward his assigned interrogator. The bright digital screen displayed a highly extensive, completely unedited history of encrypted text messages sent directly from Megan over the past 4 months. Devon frantically tapped the screen, explicitly proving that the entire malicious plot to aggressively throw Jonas into a locked psychiatric facility was solely and exclusively engineered by his fiercely ambitious wife. The undeniable digital footprint clearly outlined her highly aggressive strategy to medically extort the aging man. Devin loudly sobbed into his shaking hands aggressively, blaming Megan for meticulously orchestrating the catastrophic downfall of their entire family. He shrieked that she had aggressively threatened to financially ruin him if he refused to completely execute the fraudulent bank loan. Devin frantically offered the federal agents a massive, incredibly detailed trove of incriminating corporate emails. He promised to fully expose her highly illegal tax evasion strategies and deep involvement in the offshore wire fraud network previously managed by Bradley. He aggressively begged the federal agents for total leniency, explicitly demanding a highly favorable plea deal in direct exchange for providing the absolute undeniable proof required to permanently lock his wife in a federal penitentiary. The two deeply arrogant predators who had just hours ago considered themselves an unstoppable, highly elite corporate power couple were now actively and aggressively tearing each other completely to shreds. They entirely abandoned every single sacred vow and solemn promise they had ever legally made to one another, driven purely by the absolute suffocating terror of losing their physical freedom and immense luxury. The highly trained federal agents sat perfectly silent and completely motionless in their respective interrogation rooms, calmly documenting the massive, catastrophic, and completely irreversible implosion of a highly toxic, completely fraudulent modern marriage. They actively allowed the two terrified suspects to entirely execute one another via formal written confessions. Megan and Devin had arrogantly assumed they could completely outsmart the federal legal system by being the first to forcefully strike a bargain. Instead, they had simply provided the Department of Justice with a totally comprehensive, entirely irrefutable mountain of absolute criminal evidence. They were aggressively competing to secure a non-existent life raft, entirely unaware that their respective highly detailed confessions were simultaneously sealing their absolute mutual doom. The complete moral bankruptcy they had weaponized against Jonas was now tearing their own lives completely apart with ruthless, devastating efficiency, confirming their ultimate, entirely inescapable demise behind cold federal bars tonight. The heavy steel door of the dimly lit viewing room quietly pushed open. Jonas stepped smoothly into the narrow observation space, accompanied closely by the immaculate Attorney Hayes. They stood completely perfectly still behind the massive one-way mirrored glass, silently observing Megan aggressively finalizing her entirely fraudulent plea agreement. The lead federal agent running the massive criminal probe stood quietly near the observation monitors, respectfully acknowledging the calm presence of the stoic aging farmer. Jonas did not utter a single word of vindictive triumph. He calmly reached directly into his worn jacket pocket and retrieved a small, highly encrypted digital audio recorder. He extended his steady, heavily calloused hand, passing the sleek electronic device directly to the lead federal agent. Jonas explicitly instructed the investigator to immediately play the newly unlocked audio file. The sharp, crystal-clear recording instantly filled the quiet viewing room. The undeniable digital evidence explicitly captured Megan secretly meeting with a fully disgraced, heavily indebted local physician. The audio comprehensively proved that she had aggressively paid a massive, entirely illegal cash bribe to permanently falsify the complex psychiatric medical records intended to unlawfully institutionalize her totally innocent father-in-law. The lead federal agent paused the damning recording, his expression hardening into absolute unyielding stone. He forcefully pushed open the connecting door and marched directly into the active interrogation room. He aggressively snatched the unsigned plea agreement right off the steel table and violently ripped the heavy paper into tiny, shredded pieces right in front of her completely horrified, ruined, tear-streaked face. He explicitly informed Megan that all leniency was permanently, completely revoked. The federal government was immediately proceeding to trial. The absolute digital guillotine had dropped entirely, flawlessly executing the completely ruthless, deeply arrogant predator. Both of them were permanently heading directly to a dark federal prison tonight. The harsh reality of the federal holding cells transitioned swiftly into the equally brutal arena of the county civil court. The expansive courtroom remained mostly empty, entirely devoid of the usual local spectators. The heavy mahogany double doors remained securely shut, isolating the high-stakes financial warfare currently unfolding inside. The massive New York commercial bank had deployed an aggressively assembled legal team. 5 sharply dressed corporate litigators sat rigidly behind the polished plaintiff tables. They completely ignored the shattered couple sitting silently across the aisle. Their primary objective was entirely fiscal, aggressively seeking maximum financial restitution for the catastrophic commercial fraud. The lead banking litigator stood up, his voice echoing sharply across the silent room. He forcefully demanded the immediate total liquidation of all combined marital assets legally tied to Devon and Megan. The financial institution aggressively claimed that the severely fraudulent $400,000 loan application had triggered massive, entirely unforeseen institutional damages. They explicitly calculated the immense internal investigative costs, the extensive federal compliance penalties, and the exhaustive external legal fees generated by the catastrophic breach. The litigator formally submitted a towering stack of forensic accounting documents directly to the presiding civil judge. He ruthlessly argued that the bank possessed the absolute legal right to aggressively seize and immediately auction every single physical and liquid asset the couple possessed to fully satisfy the massive resulting debt. Devon stared blankly at the scarred wooden table, his wrists resting heavily against his lap. Megan sat entirely frozen beside him, her expensive designer suit severely wrinkled from an uncomfortable night spent shivering inside a cold federal holding cell. The banking attorneys focused their undivided attention directly upon the highly coveted 50 acres of prime Tennessee real estate, preparing to completely seize the sprawling family farm to balance their damaged ledgers. Attorney Hayes calmly stood up from the secondary defense table, entirely unbothered by the aggressive posture of the New York litigators. He meticulously smoothed the lapels of his sharp charcoal suit and confidently approached the presiding judge. Hayes explicitly stated that the commercial bank was actively attempting to illegally seize an asset that did not belong to the defendants. He smoothly extracted the original fully authenticated trust documents from his sleek leather briefcase and placed them directly onto the judicial bench. Hayes delivered his presentation with surgical, deeply clinical precision. He explicitly highlighted the unyielding, ironclad legal architecture of Evelyn Holdings. He firmly pointed out that Jonas possessed absolute, permanent, and exclusive control over the entire 50 acres of prime agricultural land. Devon legally owned absolutely nothing but the worthless physical structure of the farmhouse. Hayes then methodically revealed the devastatingly complex penalty clause permanently buried within the original ground lease. He explicitly proved that, by intentionally forging a commercial loan document and actively facilitating highly destructive cryptocurrency mining on the immediate premises, Devon had instantly triggered a catastrophic default mechanism. The physical farmhouse structure had legally reverted directly back into the absolute possession of Evelyn Holdings. The bank possessed absolutely zero claim to the sprawling Tennessee estate. The lead commercial litigator furiously snatched the heavily watermarked documents, his face turning a deep, violently angry shade of crimson. He aggressively scanned the impenetrable legal text, desperately searching for a microscopic loophole. He found absolutely none. The generational trust was a totally flawless, highly engineered legal fortress actively built to repel this exact type of hostile financial invasion. The litigator aggressively slammed the thick paperwork back onto the wooden table, instantly shifting his ruthless strategy. Denied their primary, highly coveted target, the massive financial institution pivoted with completely devastating, unforgiving brutality. The lead attorney firmly demanded the absolute immediate liquidation of every single remaining alternative asset attached to the completely ruined couple. The presiding civil judge quickly validated the ironclad trust documents and immediately authorized the aggressive alternative seizure protocol. The swift, utterly brutal financial execution began entirely without mercy. The commercial bank actively mobilized to violently tear apart the remaining corporate facade. They immediately seized total operational control of Megan's highly prized downtown media agency. The litigator explicitly informed her that every single valuable client contract, all existing office equipment, and her entire commercial operating budget were instantly confiscated to satisfy the massive investigative fees. Megan gasped loudly, her hands flying directly to her pale mouth as the entire business she had ruthlessly built was entirely wiped away. The bank did not stop there. The litigator aggressively secured an immediate judicial order to legally seize Devon's incredibly expensive, thoroughly mortgaged luxury apartment located squarely in the city. The bank formally authorized the complete draining of their heavily inflated personal retirement accounts, their shared liquid stock portfolios, and their private high-yield mutual funds. The judge methodically stamped every single liquidation order with a heavy, completely deafening mechanical thud. Each sharp strike of the wooden gavel permanently erased another massive piece of their highly arrogant, completely superficial lifestyle. Devin slumped forward heavily, burying his bruised face directly into his trembling hands. The staggering weight of absolute poverty crashed violently down upon him. He had spent his entire professional career aggressively pretending to be an immensely wealthy, entirely self-made corporate titan. Now he did not even possess enough liquid capital to ever hire a legal defense attorney. The stark reality of his complete financial destruction was entirely, utterly inescapable here today, leaving him completely, profoundly, terribly alone inside this empty room right now. The massive mahogany doors at the very rear of the expansive courtroom suddenly burst open. Megan's wealthy, deeply arrogant parents rushed frantically into the cold civil chamber, their faces pale with unadulterated panic. They had completely ignored their daughter's illegal activities for years, actively enabling her profoundly toxic behavior, but the absolute reality of her impending federal prison sentence finally shattered their comfortable suburban ignorance. Her father aggressively approached the polished wooden barrier separating the gallery from the active legal proceedings. He wildly waved a thick corporate checkbook directly at the lead banking litigator, aggressively offering to immediately purchase the entire commercial debt in full. He loudly screamed that his personal liquid wealth could instantly satisfy the massive financial judgment and permanently halt the aggressive liquidation protocol right now. The presiding civil judge slammed his wooden gavel down with terrifying absolute authority, instantly silencing the frantic man. He stared down at Megan's parents with total, unwavering judicial contempt. The judge explicitly informed them that the commercial bank was not operating independently. They were actively executing a fully coordinated asset forfeiture directly attached to an active federal money laundering investigation. The court entirely refused to halt the aggressive federal seizure, explicitly stating that no amount of private familial wealth could ever bypass the rigid parameters of a Department of Justice indictment. Megan began sobbing violently, completely realizing her wealthy parents possessed absolutely zero power to manipulate this specific catastrophic reality. Everything Devin and Megan had arrogantly built, heavily relying upon Jonas's hidden financial support, was instantly and completely wiped out by a single devastating stroke of the judge's gavel. They possessed absolutely nothing left to trade, leaving them entirely exposed, permanently impoverished, and fully prepared to directly face the brutal consequences of their impending federal criminal trial early tomorrow morning today. The heavy steel door of the Federal Visiting Center slammed shut with a completely deafening metallic echo. Jonas sat completely motionless behind the smudged, reinforced glass of the secure metal communication booth. He placed his heavily calloused hands flat against the cold metal counter, waiting in absolute, unyielding silence. A secondary door opened on the opposite side of the barrier. A heavily armed federal guard aggressively escorted Devin directly into the sterile visiting area. Devin was physically stripped of his expensive tailored suits and designer watches. He wore a stiff, bright orange federal prison jumpsuit that hung loosely around his completely defeated frame. His expensive leather shoes were perfectly replaced by cheap canvas standard institutional footwear. He shuffled slowly toward the communication booth, completely lacking his former aggressive, highly manufactured corporate swagger. Devin sat down heavily on the bolted metal stool. He lifted his head, revealing eyes that were entirely hollow, deeply sunken, and completely stripped of all his previous relentless arrogance. He picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver with violently shaking hands. Jonas slowly lifted his own receiver, pressing the cold plastic directly against his ear, waiting for his utterly broken son to finally speak right now. Devin began weeping uncontrollably the exact moment the plastic receiver touched his face. Thick, heavy tears streamed rapidly down his pale, gaunt cheeks, violently splashing onto the bright orange fabric of his federal uniform. He aggressively pressed his face directly against the smudged, reinforced glass, desperately seeking the slightest microscopic fraction of emotional comfort from the aging farmer. Devin sobbed loudly into the receiver, frantically invoking the deeply cherished memory of his deceased mother, Evelyn. He wildly begged Jonas to actively remember the immense love she had always possessed for her only biological son. Devin shrieked that Evelyn would have never willingly allowed her child to rot permanently inside a cold federal prison cell. He desperately pleaded for a father's ultimate mercy, screaming that he was utterly terrified, entirely alone, and completely incapable of surviving the brutal reality of an impending federal criminal trial. He aggressively begged Jonas to fully deploy the massive legal and financial resources of the generational trust to physically extract him from this horrific, inescapable nightmare. He wildly promised to permanently change his entire life and entirely submit to his father's absolute authority if Jonas would just silently purchase his immediate total freedom today. Jonas simply looked at his son. His heavily lined face remained completely perfectly still. His deep voice resonated through the plastic receiver with a quiet, devastatingly brutal authority. The tone contained absolutely zero hatred, but it was completely and entirely devoid of any residual paternal warmth. Jonas methodically dismantled the pathetic, highly manipulative performance playing out directly across the glass barrier. He calmly, explicitly explained that deploying the sacred memory of Evelyn to secure a massive financial bailout was profoundly insulting and entirely ineffective. Jonas meticulously detailed every single catastrophic betrayal Devon had aggressively committed over the past 4 arrogant years. He explicitly reminded Devon of the forged commercial loan documents, the completely illegal cryptocurrency mining operation hidden within the family barn, and the highly malicious, fully documented conspiracy to forcefully lock his own father inside a secure psychiatric ward. Jonas stated very clearly that this current catastrophic punishment was absolutely not about the massive commercial debt or the severe financial destruction of the rural estate. The devastating consequence was entirely about the profound, unforgivable lack of basic human loyalty. Jonas explicitly clarified that true family aggressively protects their shared legacy instead of violently tearing it apart for entirely selfish, superficial corporate greed. Devon suddenly wept much louder, his heavy sobs echoing sharply through the electronic audio feed. He violently gripped the cold steel shelf underneath the glass barrier, his knuckles turning entirely white from the absolute immense pressure, frantically claiming that Megan had entirely orchestrated the darkest elements of the massive fraud. Devon aggressively screamed that he was simply a weak, easily manipulated participant who had made several highly destructive but entirely correctable mistakes. Jonas completely ignored the pathetic, desperate deflection, actively refusing to grant his son even the absolute slightest degree of unearned absolution. He firmly reminded Devon that a grown man must entirely own the absolute reality of his personal choices. Jonas calmly stated that Devon had aggressively bet his entire future upon his father's perceived weakness and complete ignorance. Devon himself had actively chosen to forcefully align himself with absolute corruption, and now he must permanently endure the total devastating weight of that terrible decision. Jonas calmly spoke with absolute surgical precision, heavily emphasizing that the federal government was simply executing the exact destruction that Devon had willingly invited directly into his own life. He explicitly declared that Devon was no longer viewed as a beloved family member, but strictly recognized as a highly dangerous, completely toxic external threat that had to be surgically neutralized to ensure the permanent survival of the historical farm. The aging farmer looked directly into the hollow, terrified eyes of his broken son, making it completely, undeniably clear that absolutely no miraculous, magical financial rescue was ever coming from the family estate tonight or any other day. The massive, heavy generational trust was permanently, entirely sealed against the deeply arrogant corporate predator sitting completely exposed inside the cold, sterile federal holding cell right now, effectively ending his entire miserable existence here today, forever. Jonas reached smoothly inside his worn jacket pocket and retrieved a single, meticulously folded sheet of heavily watermarked legal paper. He firmly flattened the crisp document and calmly slid it directly through the narrow metallic communication slot. It was an absolute, legally binding formal renunciation of all future generational inheritance. Jonas explicitly offered one singular, incredibly harsh final deal. He stated that if Devon willingly and permanently signed away every single microscopic fraction of his biological right to the massive Evelyn Holdings Trust right now, Jonas would formally drop the secondary state criminal charges regarding the actively stolen agricultural truck. The federal wire fraud charges would absolutely remain entirely intact and completely unforgiving, but Devon would successfully avoid adding consecutive state court grand theft auto convictions to his incredibly catastrophic, totally ruinous impending federal sentence. Devon stared completely blankly at the unyielding legal contract resting on the cold steel shelf. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that his wealthy father was permanently erasing him from the familial bloodline forever. The total, comprehensive devastation was finally complete. Devon's hands shook violently as he desperately reached for the cheap institutional pen chained to the thick metal wall. He aggressively pressed the blue ink directly against the crisp white paper, violently scrawling his completely worthless signature across the bottom dotted line. He actively wept as the dark ink permanently bound his absolute total disinheritance. Jonas calmly retrieved the signed, heavily watermarked document, meticulously folding it back into his deep jacket pocket. He stood up very slowly from the cold, bolted metal stool, absolutely securely severing the deep biological tie that had firmly bound them together for exactly 30 full years. Jonas silently turned his back and slowly walked away completely, leaving his permanently disowned son totally alone inside the terrifying, inescapable federal cage today. The heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse swung open with a resounding, echoing thud. Jonas stepped out onto the expansive marble landing, his boots striking the polished stone with deliberate, measured precision. The sky above the sprawling city was a deep, bruised gray, heavily overcast but entirely dry. The oppressive, suffocating humidity of the previous weeks had finally broken, leaving behind a sharp, cold wind that swept aggressively across the concrete plaza. Inside that massive, unyielding stone building, the federal judge had just delivered the absolute final blow to the fraudulent cryptocurrency syndicate. Bradley, the arrogant architect of the massive digital theft, had been formally and permanently sentenced to 5 consecutive years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The prosecution had meticulously detailed the grand larceny, the deliberate and catastrophic sabotage of the county power grid, and the massive, undeniable wire fraud. The judge had explicitly stripped away every single remaining ounce of Bradley's manufactured corporate dignity, legally reducing the slick digital entrepreneur to a completely ruined, permanently branded federal felon. Jonas walked slowly toward the wide concrete stairs, his lined face reflecting an absolute, unwavering calm. He did not feel a single microscopic shred of vindictive joy or triumphant satisfaction. He simply felt the profound, settling peace of witnessing a highly dangerous, fundamentally toxic infection being surgically and permanently excised from the healthy tissue of his family legacy. He pulled his thick canvas jacket tighter against the biting wind, fully prepared to return to the quiet, undisturbed sanctuary of his 50-acre farm. The massive legal war was officially entirely over. The relentless predators who had aggressively attempted to seize his land were comprehensively destroyed. Jonas reached the edge of the landing, ready to descend the stairs and entirely leave the ruined corporate syndicate behind him forever right now today. A sharp, entirely desperate movement entirely blocked his downward path. Megan stood rigidly on the third concrete step, completely obstructing his exit. She was completely unrecognizable from the impeccably groomed, highly arrogant corporate executive who had aggressively invaded his rural farmhouse just weeks ago. She clutched a single, scuffed canvas duffel bag tightly to her chest, her knuckles completely white from the immense, straining pressure. Her expensive designer clothing hung loosely upon her trembling frame, wrinkled and deeply stained from days of absolute, inescapable poverty. The federal government had ruthlessly executed their total asset seizure systematically, freezing every single corporate bank account, draining her offshore digital wallets, and formally locking her out of her own luxury downtown properties. Her husband was currently sitting inside a sterile federal holding cell awaiting his own catastrophic sentencing, and her brother was now a formally convicted federal inmate. Megan possessed absolutely nothing but the cheap bag in her shaking hands and the cold concrete beneath her feet. She stared wildly up at the aging farmer, her eyes completely bloodshot and burning with a pure, unadulterated, toxic hatred. The absolute reality of her total, permanent destruction had finally shattered her mind, leaving only a desperate, vicious rage. She aggressively lunged forward, her voice cracking loudly as she screamed directly into the cold city wind. She violently demanded that Jonas look at the absolute catastrophic wreckage he had actively created today. She shrieked that he was a deeply sick, entirely heartless monster who had maliciously destroyed a perfectly beautiful family simply to protect a worthless, completely irrelevant piece of rural dirt. Megan aggressively swung her free hand through the cold air, completely ignoring the federal marshals casually observing the pathetic scene from the massive glass doors above. She loudly accused Jonas of meticulously engineering an illegal, deeply corrupt trap entirely designed to forcefully strip her of her rightful corporate success. She completely erased her own relentless greed, aggressively painting herself as a completely innocent victim of a vicious, vindictive old man who utterly despised modern progress. Jonas stood perfectly still on the marble landing, allowing her frantic, screaming voice to wash entirely over him without absorbing a single microscopic drop of her venom. He calmly watched her tear-streaked face contort with absolute panic, observing the exact predictable behavior of a cornered parasite violently entirely severed from its primary host. She viciously demanded an immediate cash settlement, wildly insisting that Evelyn Holdings still possessed the liquid capital to instantly restore her frozen accounts and completely resurrect her ruined media agency. She aggressively threatened to contact the city press loudly, promising to ruthlessly destroy his public reputation by exposing his extreme cruelty to the entire world. Megan screamed that he owed her absolute financial restitution for actively ruining the bright, highly lucrative future she was legally entitled to possess. She dropped the canvas duffel bag onto the hard concrete, her entire body shaking violently as she aggressively demanded that Jonas instantly write a massive corporate check right now to completely fix the massive federal disaster he had intentionally caused. The sheer overwhelming audacity of her desperate demands echoed loudly across the cold, open plaza. She aggressively stepped closer, invading his physical space, violently demanding that he immediately acknowledge the catastrophic pain he had actively inflicted upon her broken life today. Her shrill voice carried across the empty steps, utterly devoid of logic, desperate to shift the crushing guilt weighing entirely upon her own entirely corrupt, completely guilty soul directly onto him forever right now. He simply listened patiently, utterly unbothered by the completely erratic, totally violent display today. Jonas stopped completely still upon the cold marble stairs. He slowly turned his head, fixing his dark, piercing eyes directly upon the violently trembling, completely ruined woman. His heavily lined face remained an absolute, impenetrable mask of total calm. He did not raise his deep voice, nor did he physically flinch under her aggressive, toxic verbal assault. He smoothly reached back into the darkest corners of their deeply toxic history, entirely retrieving the exact, incredibly arrogant phrase she had aggressively spat directly into his ear just over 1 single month ago. Jonas explicitly reminded Megan of the cold, deeply patronizing phone call where she had ruthlessly commanded him to silently surrender his life. He quietly stated that she had forcefully told him that if he did not entirely like the new living arrangement, he should simply sell his own property. Jonas stepped forward, his commanding presence actively forcing her to completely retreat down the concrete steps. He explicitly declared that he had thoroughly evaluated her unsolicited corporate advice. He coldly stated that he ultimately chose to effectively sell her entirely off instead. The completely brutal, entirely unyielding verbal strike instantly silenced her frantic screaming. Megan stood completely paralyzed on the wide stairs, her jaw trembling violently as the absolute finality of his dark words completely crushed her. Jonas did not offer another single glance. He smoothly descended the remaining stairs, actively bypassing her entirely ruined form. He confidently and deliberately stepped directly into the massive, heavy driver's seat of his idling, heavy agricultural pickup truck. The massive diesel engine roared loudly as he swiftly drove completely away permanently, leaving Megan entirely alone on the freezing concrete steps to actively face her completely cold, utterly desolate, entirely destroyed permanent future without absolutely any remaining hope forever right here, right now, today. The brilliant Tennessee sun burned brightly over the sprawling 50-acre estate, casting sharp, golden light across the heavily saturated pastures. The violent, unrelenting thunderstorm of the previous night had completely dissipated, leaving behind a perfectly clear, crisp morning that felt entirely like a profound physical rebirth. Inside the main living room of the farmhouse, the suffocating, oppressive mechanical hum of the massive cryptocurrency operation was permanently silenced. Jonas stood firmly in the very center of the heavily damaged space, holding a massive steel-headed sledgehammer tightly in his calloused hands. His broad shoulders rolled backward as he forcefully hoisted the heavy tool high into the quiet air. He swung the heavy sledgehammer downward with absolute, unyielding momentum. The solid steel head crashed violently into the remaining black metal server racks Bradley had hastily abandoned during the massive federal raid. The sharp, deafening sound of shattering plastic and twisting metal echoed loudly throughout the empty structural halls. Jonas did not swing the heavy tool out of blind, uncontrolled rage. He operated with a deeply methodical, entirely calculated, and highly clinical precision. He aggressively swung the heavy hammer again, violently smashing through a thick bundle of heavy copper wiring that had maliciously drained the local county power grid. He aggressively ripped the severed electrical cables directly out of the ruined drywall, forcefully tossing the destroyed synthetic components directly onto the scarred, burned floorboards. The massive toxic parasitic infection that had aggressively attempted to consume his historical family home was currently being physically and completely eradicated by his own two hands. Jonas struck the final standing aluminum chassis, completely collapsing the expensive digital hardware into a pathetic, mangled pile of worthless metallic garbage. He lowered the heavy sledgehammer, his breathing perfectly steady and completely controlled. The brilliant morning light streamed brightly through the pristine glass windows, washing over the broken electronic ruins. The toxic corporate shadow that had severely choked his home was completely obliterated today. The crisp morning air flowing smoothly through the open wooden doors finally felt completely pure, perfectly clean, and entirely safe again inside his own house right now today. A convoy of heavy work trucks rolled smoothly up the long gravel driveway, signaling the arrival of a highly skilled team of trusted local carpenters. Jonas had explicitly hired the seasoned rural craftsmen to actively restore the immense physical damage inflicted upon the main residential structure. They immediately unloaded their heavy professional equipment, aggressively attacking the ruined drywall and thoroughly burned wooden floorboards left entirely behind by the disastrous cryptocurrency server farm. The sharp, industrious sounds of spinning circular saws and rapid pneumatic nail guns completely replaced the highly toxic digital buzzing that had severely plagued the historical estate. Jonas actively refused to let the hired contractors handle the massive piles of completely shattered electronic garbage. He explicitly reserved that specific, highly symbolic task entirely for himself. He heavily loaded his broad shoulders with massive armfuls of completely crushed server chassis, heavily tangled copper wiring, and destroyed cooling fans. He methodically carried every single ruined digital component directly across the sprawling property line to a massive industrial steel dumpster rented exclusively for this exact permanent purge. He forcefully hurled the twisted metal directly over the high rusted rim, listening to the heavy debris violently crash down into the absolute bottom of the hollow steel container. The methodical, totally exhausting physical labor actively mirrored the profound emotional extraction actively occurring deep within his own chest. Jonas aggressively returned to the main farmhouse and systematically gathered every single physical object that permanently linked his disgraced son to the generational estate. He aggressively cleared out Devon's old childhood bedroom, stripping the wooden shelves of all forgotten trophies, dusty corporate literature, and expensive tailored clothing Megan had explicitly deemed too rustic for their city penthouse. Jonas did not pack the personal items into neat cardboard boxes for future corporate storage. He aggressively carried the heavy loads entirely in his raw hands, marching repeatedly back and forth across the sunlit yard. He violently threw expensive silk ties, custom leather shoes, and framed corporate awards directly into the filthy industrial dumpster, allowing the expensive material items to land haphazardly upon the shattered, highly toxic digital servers. He was entirely removing every single microscopic trace of his deeply arrogant, totally corrupt son from the very foundation of the historical farm. The brutal, utterly, completely uncompromising physical eviction formally represented an absolute, totally permanent emotional severance. Devon had actively chosen to completely weaponize his own biological bloodline, maliciously utilizing his familial position to ruthlessly orchestrate a massive, highly illegal financial theft against his own father. Jonas was now actively reciprocating that dark betrayal by permanently erasing Devon from the physical and historical reality of the 50-acre Tennessee property. He aggressively threw the final stack of Devon's abandoned college textbooks directly into the deep steel dumpster. Jonas wiped the thick sweat from his lined forehead, staring down at the massive pile of entirely discarded memories and ruined digital ambition. He felt absolutely zero lingering regret or microscopic sorrow. He felt only a profound, incredibly clean sense of total survival. The deeply parasitic infection was completely physically removed, completely, entirely ripped directly from the very core of the solid wooden farmhouse. Jonas securely locked the heavy steel doors of the rented dumpster, completely, permanently sealing the dark, completely toxic corporate chapter of his entire life forever right now, today. The sharp, sudden ringing of his mobile phone instantly broke the quiet, peaceful silence settling over the sunlit Tennessee property. Jonas smoothly wiped his dusty hands across his thick canvas work trousers and calmly retrieved the vibrating device directly from his deep front pocket. It was an incoming call from Attorney Hayes. Jonas quietly answered the phone, pressing the small digital speaker directly against his ear. Hayes did not offer any unnecessary conversational pleasantries. He delivered the final, incredibly crucial legal update with absolute clinical professional efficiency. Hayes explicitly confirmed that the final, highly complex deed transfer was officially entirely complete. The massive New York commercial bank had successfully processed the absolute legal default initiated by the highly destructive cryptocurrency operation. They had formally and completely removed Devon's fraudulent name directly from the structural residential title. The completely worthless, heavily compromised residential deed was permanently dissolved. The physical farmhouse, the sprawling 50 acres of prime agricultural dirt, and the incredibly lucrative deep mineral rights were all officially safely consolidated entirely back under the absolute impenetrable protection of Evelyn Holdings. Hayes explicitly stated that the massive generational trust was now perfectly legally secured, forming an absolute, completely unbreakable financial fortress. Jonas listened entirely silently, feeling a profound, incredibly powerful wave of total, absolute closure wash entirely over him right now. The historical family legacy was permanently untouchable by anyone ever holding the dangerously entitled, entirely toxic status of a biological relative. He firmly thanked his fiercely loyal attorney and slowly, completely ended the phone call. Jonas calmly slid the mobile device back into his pocket, turning to look directly at the fully restored, entirely peaceful farmhouse standing completely proudly under the incredibly bright morning sun forever, entirely, completely, perfectly safe today, knowing his entire legacy would remain totally, permanently, perfectly protected right now. Jonas sat heavily upon the weathered oak bench positioned squarely on his wide front porch. A fresh steaming cup of bitter black coffee rested quietly on the scarred wooden table beside him. The ceramic mug radiated a comforting heat against the sharp morning chill. The dense Tennessee air smelled rich and heavy, completely saturated with the dark scent of wet agricultural soil and the sweet fragrance of newly blooming hydrangeas. The sprawling 50 acres stretching out before him were completely, entirely silent. The deafening mechanical roar of the destructive server farms was permanently eradicated, and the chaotic, frantic energy of his corrupt relatives was completely purged from the atmosphere. He breathed in the crisp air, filling his aged lungs with the pure, undisturbed essence of the rural landscape he had fought so ruthlessly to protect. The golden morning sun climbed slowly above the distant tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the freshly repaired farmhouse floorboards visible through the large bay windows. The hired carpenters had finished their exhaustive restoration late yesterday evening, leaving the generational home perfectly intact and structurally flawless. Jonas watched a single red hawk circle lazily high above the eastern pasture, completely unbothered by the massive legal and emotional warfare that had recently concluded below. The total absence of human noise was profoundly striking. There were absolutely no ringing cell phones, no aggressive demands for unearned corporate capital, and no toxic manipulation echoing through the wooden halls. The silence was not empty. It was incredibly heavy with absolute, undeniable victory. Jonas grasped the hot coffee mug with his calloused, deeply scarred hands, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The dark liquid burned pleasantly down his throat, grounding him entirely in the physical reality of his massive survival. He was now finally entirely, utterly, completely, totally alone today. He calmly placed the warm ceramic mug back onto the wooden table and slowly reached into the deep pocket of his thick canvas jacket. His rough fingers securely grasped the smooth, worn surface of a heavy leather journal. It officially belonged to his late wife, Evelyn. Jonas carefully extracted the thick diary and placed it gently upon his lap. The dark leather cover was completely smooth, entirely softened by decades of loving, careful handling. He slowly opened the heavy cover, gazing directly at the neat, precise handwriting filling the crisp white pages. A very brief, incredibly fleeting shadow of deep mourning suddenly passed over his weathered features. He actively allowed himself exactly one singular, entirely brief moment of pure sorrow for the innocent biological son he had officially completely lost forever. Devon had once been a bright, highly energetic child running entirely freely across these exact green pastures, fully surrounded by absolute parental love. That innocent boy had been completely erased by relentless corporate greed, highly toxic metropolitan ambition, and an absolutely insatiable hunger for unearned financial power. Devon had aggressively transformed into a ruthless, fully weaponized corporate predator, completely entirely willing to unlawfully institutionalize his own blood father simply to acquire a lucrative commercial estate. Jonas closed his dark eyes, acknowledging the devastating, tragic reality of that terrible, irreversible transformation. He fully realized that he could not ever magically resurrect the loving son Evelyn had originally birthed. The incredibly brief, highly intense shadow of paternal grief was completely and instantly extinguished by a profoundly deep, incredibly powerful sense of absolute enduring peace. Jonas opened his eyes, entirely shedding the final remaining microscopic drop of biological guilt. He had successfully, clinically, and meticulously excised the massive, highly malignant familial tumor that was actively, silently killing his entire life. The deep, parasitic infection deliberately introduced by Devon and completely magnified by Megan was now officially entirely obliterated from his physical existence. Jonas felt absolutely zero lingering regret regarding the devastatingly brutal, totally unforgiving federal consequences currently actively destroying their respective lives inside cold government cages right now. He felt only the pure, entirely cold, incredibly hard satisfaction of absolute total survival. He had aggressively fought a massive, deeply asymmetrical financial war entirely designed to forcefully strip him of his generational property and his basic human dignity. Instead of quietly surrendering to their completely ruthless, highly sophisticated corporate execution, Jonas had methodically completely disassembled their entire fraudulent empire brick by brick. He had legally weaponized the original foundational trust, actively trapping the arrogant thieves entirely inside their own complex, malicious architecture. They had arrogantly assumed his rural simplicity actively equaled profound intellectual weakness. They had fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood the absolute fierce, totally unyielding, completely ruthless nature of a desperate father actively defending his sacred generational dirt. Jonas slowly turned the thick paper pages of the old leather journal, smoothly running his rough fingers directly over the beautiful handwriting of Evelyn. He was actively reading her gentle, incredibly loving passages, entirely describing the bright, fully beautiful future she had originally desperately wanted for their only child. Jonas calmly acknowledged that her beautiful, innocent dream was completely permanently dead today. The past was totally formally concluded right now. He had successfully entirely protected Evelyn Holdings from absolute catastrophic total ruin today. The sprawling green fields rolling completely smoothly toward the distant bright southern horizon represented absolute enduring permanent victory. He breathed out slowly, completely and deeply satisfied with his permanent, ultimate, total familial victory over the dark corporate evil that had maliciously invaded his sacred private physical sanctuary forever right now today, completely, entirely, perfectly. Jonas slowly reached down toward the scarred wooden table and calmly picked up his heavy black cellular phone. He entirely purposefully unlocked the bright digital screen, firmly navigating directly into his extensive personal contact list. He scrolled precisely through the alphabetized names until he completely located the specific contact explicitly labeled for Devon. He stared entirely silently at the bright digital letters for exactly one singular microscopic second. He absolutely did not hesitate or physically flinch. Jonas pressed the small digital delete command, permanently erasing the digital presence of his son completely from the active device right now. He immediately scrolled further down the bright screen, methodically locating the personal corporate number of Megan. He swiftly executed the exact same permanent digital deletion, totally wiping her entirely toxic existence completely from his immediate personal reality. The absolute total digital purge was completely, entirely successfully finalized today. Jonas smoothly set the heavy black phone directly back down onto the wooden table, permanently disconnecting entirely from the chaotic, deeply fraudulent corporate metropolitan world forever. He slowly stood up from the comfortable oak bench, completely, entirely stretching his broad, heavily muscled shoulders under the incredibly bright morning sun. He calmly reached entirely across the wide wooden porch railing and firmly grasped a pair of heavy steel gardening shears. The solid, extremely sharp metal tool felt absolutely perfectly, completely natural, securely resting inside his calloused hands right now. He turned slowly away from the beautifully restored farmhouse and confidently walked completely directly toward the sprawling, heavily overgrown front flower beds. It was an incredibly late, highly unconventional new physical beginning for an aging farmer. However, for the absolute first time in his entire long rural life, the beautiful surrounding world finally completely perfectly belonged exclusively to him today, right here, entirely, now, forever, permanently. Allowing toxic individuals to systematically consume your life, even if they share your blood, ultimately destroys your own spirit. Reclaiming your peace often requires making devastatingly difficult choices to permanently sever ties with those who weaponize your affection. True victory is achieving peaceful survival and honoring yourself when ungrateful relatives choose absolute total betrayal. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts on this intense conclusion below right now, today, forever.